statement for Cold Harbour Lane in Brixton, where many Windrush passengers came to look for work and make their homes. I can tell the Home Secretary that it is entirely wrong for her to present this as a new problem which has suddenly arisen. It has been going on for years, and it is a consequence of government policy which lacks any grace or compassion, and which in its intolerance looks for any possible reason why people who have come here from overseas should not be allowed to stay. Will the Home Secretary now commit to look at the systemic problems with UKVI and reform the immigration system so that people who have made their lives in this country and contributed so much can live with security and dignity in their old age?
That's exactly what I want this country to look like. The sort of country where her constituents can have confidence here. I would point out to the Honourable Lady that it was, of course, Labour who introduced the labour market test so that people had to evidence their status in 2008. So this hasn't started entirely with us, but if we want to live in a country where there is a difference between legal and illegal residents here, then it is absolutely right to have a system which addresses that.
Mr David Linden.
Mr Speaker, if the Secretary of State is saying that there's no way of checking whether or not someone's been wrongly deported, does that mean it's the same for asylum seekers as well?
Mr Speaker, I only heard part of the Honourable Gentleman's question, but I can tell him that I do not know of any cases where people have been removed, but I have said to members here, as I've said to the High Commissioners, if they know of any cases, they should bring them to us.
Emma Reynolds.
Speaker, my constituent Paulette Wilson came here from Jamaica in 1968, aged 10. She worked in the UK all her life, including here in Parliament. Last October, she was detained at Yarlswood and threatened with being deported. The Home Secretary says she doesn't know the extent of this problem or the numbers, but surely a simple search by date of birth and origin would give her that data. Will she go away and have a look at that?
Well, if the Honourable Lady wants to write to me with a particular case, I will certainly look at it. But I would say that I have put out an instruction today that there will be no detention or removal of anybody in this cohort who makes any questions. So I have removed that fear, but I'm much more ambitious than that. I want to make sure that our new dedicated unit really addresses this and sorts out, to the satisfaction of everybody involved, the individual status of the people who have come here and contributed so much.
Mrs Louise Ellman.
Will the Home Secretary instruct the Home Office to be supportive to individuals who apply under this scheme, rather than leave already traumatised individuals having to meet very, very difficult requirements when they are already in such distress? Yes, the default position will be to accept. The only real change to that will be if there is serious criminality. We will need to work with the individuals to ensure that the information is collected, but I want to make sure this works for the individuals. As I said earlier, this is about individuals whose lives have been upset, who need the reassurance. I want to make sure that they get it.
Finally, Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I often want to offer the members opposite who maybe don't understand what it's like to work with the Home Office every single day, if they would like to come and work in my constituency office, so I put that offer out there. Can I ask, as somebody who works with them every single day, how many people will be in this team? And how long will this team last for? Because this is not a problem that is going to go away overnight.
Home Secretary.
I work with the Home Office every day, I would say to the Honourable Lady, and I am aware of some of the challenges. The team will have 20 people in it. It will deliver what I have set out to say today, and we will see how long it is needed. What I'm interested in is outcomes, effective, sympathetic outcomes for the people who need it, who are so valued by this country.
Thank you. Order. Statement of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, before I come to the substance of my statement, I am sure the whole House will wish to join me in offering our heartfelt condolences to the family and friends of Sergeant Matt Tonrow from the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, who was killed by an improvised explosive device on the 29th of March. Sergeant Tonrow was embedded with US forces on a counter-Daesh operation. He served his country with great distinction, and it is clear he was a gifted and intelligent instructor who was respected by everyone he served with. Sergeant Tonrow fought to protect British values, our freedoms, and to keep this country safe. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the actions that we have taken, together with our American and French allies, to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capabilities and to deter their future use. On Saturday, the 7th of April, up to 75 people, including young children, were killed in a horrific attack in Douma, with as many as 500 further casualties. All indications are that this was a chemical weapons attack. UK medical and scientific experts have analysed open source reports, images and video footage from the incident and concluded that the victims were exposed to a toxic chemical. This is corroborated by first-hand accounts from NGOs and aid workers. While the World Health Organization received reports that hundreds of patients arrived at Syrian health facilities on Saturday night with signs and symptoms consistent with exposure to toxic chemicals. And based on our assessment, we do not think that these reports could be falsified on this scale. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the Syrian regime has reportedly been attempting to conceal the evidence by searching evacuees from Douma to ensure samples are not being smuggled from this area. And a wider operation to conceal the facts of the attack is underway, supported by the Russians. Mr. Speaker, the images of this suffering are utterly haunting. Innocent families, seeking shelter in underground bunkers, found dead with foam in their mouths, burns to their eyes, and their bodies surrounded by a chlorine-like odour. Children gasping for life as chemicals choked their lungs. The fact that such an atrocity can take place in our world today is a stain on our humanity. And we are clear about who is responsible. A significant body of information, including intelligence, indicates the Syrian regime is responsible for this latest attack. Open source accounts state that barrel bombs were used to deliver the chemicals. Barrel bombs are usually delivered by helicopters. Multiple open source reports and intelligence indicates that regime helicopters operated over Douma on the evening of the 7th of April, shortly before reports emerged in social media of a chemical attack. And the Syrian military officials coordinated what appears to be the use of chlorine weapons. Mr. Speaker, no other group could have carried out this attack. The opposition does not operate helicopters or use barrel bombs. Daesh does not even have a presence in Douma. And the reports of this attack are consistent with previous regime attacks. These include the attack on the 21st of August 2013, where over 800 people were killed and thousands more injured in a chemical attack also in Ghouta. 14 further smaller-scale chemical attacks reported prior to that summer. 3 further chlorine attacks in 2014 and 2015, which the independent UNSC-mandated investigation attributed to the regime. And the attack at Khan Sheikhoun on the 4th of April last year, where the Syrian regime used sarin against its people, killing around 100 with a further 500 casualties. Based on the regime's persistent pattern of behaviour and the cumulative analysis of specific incidents, we judged it highly likely that the Syrian regime had continued to use chemical weapons on at least 4 occasions since the attack in Khan Sheikhoun, and we judged that they would have continued to do so. So we needed to intervene rapidly to alleviate further indiscriminate humanitarian suffering. Mr. Speaker, we've explored every possible diplomatic channel to do so, but our efforts have been repeatedly thwarted. Following the sarin attack in eastern Damascus back in August 2013, the Syrian regime committed to dismantle its chemical weapon programme, and Russia promised to ensure that Syria did this, overseen by the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. At the weekend, the leader of the opposition cited this diplomatic agreement as a precedent that this process can work. But this process did not work. It did not eradicate the chemical weapons capability of the Syrian regime, with only last month the OPCW finding that Syria's declaration of its former chemical weapons programme is incomplete. And as I've already set out, it did not stop the Syrian regime from carrying out the most abhorrent atrocities using these weapons. Furthermore, on each occasion when we have seen every sign of chemical weapons being used, Russia has blocked any attempt to hold the perpetrators to account at the UN Security Council, with 6 such vetoes since the start of 2017. And just last week, Russia blocked a UN resolution that would have established an independent investigation able to determine responsibility for this latest attack. So regrettably, we had no choice but to conclude that diplomatic action on its own is not going to work. The Leader of the Opposition has said that he can only countenance involvement in Syria if there is UN authority behind it. The House should be clear. That would mean a Russian veto on our foreign policy. When the Cabinet met on Thursday, we considered the advice of the Attorney-General. Based on this advice, we agreed that it was not just morally right, but also legally right to take military action, together with our closest allies, to alleviate further humanitarian suffering. This was not about intervening in a civil war, and it was not about regime change. It was about a limited, targeted and effective strike that sought to alleviate the humanitarian suffering of the Syrian people by degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring their use. And we have published the legal basis for this action. It required 3 conditions to be met. First, there must be convincing evidence generally accepted by the international community as a whole of extreme humanitarian distress on a large scale, requiring immediate and urgent relief. Second, it must be objectively clear that there is no practicable alternative to the use of force if lives are to be saved. And third, the proposed use of force must be necessary and proportionate to the aim of relief of humanitarian suffering and must be strictly limited in time and in scope to this aim. These are the same 3 criteria used as the legal justification for the UK's role in the NATO intervention in Kosovo. Our intervention in 1991 with the US and France, and in 1992 with the US, to create safe havens and enforce the no-fly zones in Iraq following the Gulf War, were also justified on the basis of humanitarian intervention. So governments of all colours have long considered that military action on an exceptional basis, where necessary and proportionate, and as a last resort to avert an overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe, is permissible under international law. Mr. Speaker, I've set out why we are convinced by the evidence and why there was no practicable alternative. Let me set out how this military response was also proportionate. This was a limited, targeted and effective strike that would significantly degrade Syrian chemical weapons capabilities and deter their future use, and with clear boundaries that expressly sought to avoid escalation and did everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. As a result, the coordinated actions of the US, UK and France were successfully and specifically targeted at 3 sites. Contrary to what the Leader of the Opposition said at the weekend, these were not empty buildings. The first was the Baza branch of the Scientific Studies and Research Centre in northern Damascus. This was a centre for the research and development of Syria's chemical and biological programme. It was hit by 57 American TLAMs and 19 American JASSMs. The second site was the Him Shinzar chemical weapons bunkers, 15 miles west of the city of Homs, which contained both a chemical weapons equipment and storage facility and an important command post. These were successfully hit by 7 French Scalp cruise missiles. And the third site was the Him Shinzar chemical weapons storage site and former missile base, which is now a military facility. This was assessed to be a location of Syrian sarin and precursor production equipment, whose destruction would degrade Syria's ability to deliver sarin in the future. This was hit by 9 US TLAMs, 5 naval and 2 Scalp cruise missiles from France, and 8 Storm Shadow missiles launched by R4 RAF Tornado GR4s. Very careful scientific analysis was used to determine where best to target these missiles to maximise the destruction of stockpiled chemicals and to minimise any risk to the surrounding area. And the facility that we targeted is located some distance from any known population centres, reducing yet further any such risk of civilian casualties. Mr. Speaker, while targeted and limited, these strikes by the US, UK and France were significantly larger than the US action a year ago after the attack at Khan Sheikhoun, and specifically designed to have a greater impact on the regime's capability and willingness to use chemical weapons. We also minimise the chances of wider escalation through our carefully targeted approach, and the House will note that Russia has not reported any losses of personnel or equipment as a result of these strikes. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in paying tribute to all the British servicemen and women and their American and French allies who successfully carried out this mission with such courage and professionalism. Mr. Speaker, let me deal specifically with three important questions. First, why did we not wait for the investigation from the OPCW? UNSC mandated inspectors have investigated previous attacks and on 4 occasions decided that the regime was indeed responsible. We are confident in our own assessment that the Syrian regime was highly likely responsible for this attack and that its persistent pattern of behaviour meant that it was highly likely to continue using chemical weapons. Furthermore, there were clearly attempts to block any proper investigation, as we saw with the Russian veto at the UN earlier in the week. And let me set this out in detail. We support strongly the work of the OPCW fact-finding mission that is currently in Damascus. But that mission is only able to make an assessment of whether chemical weapons were used. Even if the OPCW team is able to visit Douma to gather information to make that assessment, and they are currently being prevented from doing so by the regime and the Russians, it cannot attribute responsibility. This is because Russia vetoed in November 2017 an extension of the joint investigatory mechanism set up to do this. And last week, in the wake of the Douma attack, it again vetoed a new UNSC resolution to re-establish such a mechanism. And even if we had OPCW's findings and a mechanism to attribute, for as long as Russia continues to veto, the UN Security Council still would not be able to act. So, Mr. Speaker, we cannot wait to alleviate further humanitarian suffering caused by chemical weapons attacks. Second, were we not just following orders from America? Let me be absolutely clear. We have acted because it is in our national interest to do so. It is in our national interest to prevent the further use of chemical weapons in Syria and to uphold and defend the global consensus that these weapons should not be used. For we cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised, either within Syria, on the streets of the UK or elsewhere. So we have not done this because President Trump asked us to do so. We have done it because we believed it was the right thing to do, and we are not alone. There is broad-based international support for the action we've taken. NATO has issued a statement setting out its support, as have the Gulf Cooperation Council and a number of countries in the region. And over the weekend, I have spoken to a range of world leaders, including Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Gentiloni, Prime Minister Trudeau, Prime Minister Turnbull, and European Union Council President Donald Tusk. All have expressed their support for the actions that Britain, France, and America have taken. Third, why did we not recall Parliament? Mr. Speaker, the speed with which we acted was essential in cooperating with our partners to alleviate further humanitarian suffering and to maintain the vital security of our operations. This was a limited, targeted strike on a legal basis that has been used before, and it was a decision which required the evaluation of intelligence and information, much of which was of a nature that could not be shared with Parliament. We have always been clear that the government has the right to act quickly in the national interest. I am absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker, that it is Parliament's responsibility to hold me to account for such decisions, and Parliament will do so. But it is my responsibility as Prime Minister to make these decisions, and I will make them. Mr. Speaker, as I have been clear, this military action was not about intervening in the civil war in Syria or about regime change. But we are determined to do our utmost to help resolve the conflict in Syria. That means concluding the fight against Daesh, which still holds pockets of territory in Syria. It means working to enable humanitarian access and continuing our efforts at the forefront of global response, where the UK has already committed almost £2.5 billion, our largest ever response to a single humanitarian crisis. And next week we will attend the second Brussels conference on supporting the future of Syria and the region, which will focus on humanitarian support, bolstering the UN-led political process in Geneva, and ensuring continued international support to refugees and host countries, driving forward the legacy of our own London conference held in 2016. And it means supporting international efforts to reinvigorate the process to deliver a political solution, for this is the best long-term hope for the Syrian people. The UK will do all of these things, but as I've also been clear, that is not what these military strikes were about. Mr. Speaker, as I've set out, the military action that we have taken this weekend was specifically focused on degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring their future use. In order to achieve this, there must also be a wider diplomatic effort, including the full range of political and economic levers, to strengthen the global norms prohibiting the use of chemical weapons, which have stood for nearly a century. So we will continue to work with our international partners on tough economic action against those involved with the production or dissemination of chemical weapons. And I welcome the conclusion of today's European Foreign Affairs Council, attended by my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, that confirmed the Council is willing to consider further restrictive measures on those involved in the development and use of chemical weapons in Syria. We will continue to push for the re-establishment of an international investigative mechanism which can attribute responsibility for chemical weapon use in Syria. We will advance with our French allies the new international partnership against impunity for the use of chemical weapons, which will meet in the coming weeks. And we will continue to strengthen the international coalition we have built since the attack on Salisbury. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday's report from the OPCW has confirmed our findings that it was indeed a Novichok in Salisbury, and I've placed a copy of that report's executive summary in the Library of the House. While of a much lower order of magnitude, the use of a nerve agent on the streets of Salisbury is part of a pattern of disregard for the global norms that prohibit the use of chemical weapons. So while the action was taken to alleviate humanitarian suffering in Syria by degrading the regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring its use of these weapons, it will also send a clear message to anyone who believes they can use chemical weapons with impunity. We cannot go back to a world where the use of chemical weapons becomes normalised. Mr. Speaker, I'm deeply conscious of the gravity of these decisions. They affect all members of this House and me personally, and I understand the questions that rightly will be asked about British military action, particularly in such a complex region. But I am clear that the way we protect our national interest is to stand up for the global rules and standards that keep us safe. That is what we have done and what we will continue to do, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by thanking the Prime Minister for our phone conversation in advance of the bombing raids on Friday night and for an advance copy of her statement today. I also join her in paying tribute to Sergeant Matt Tunrow, the SAS sniper from Manchester who was killed on the 28th of March with US forces in northern Syria, and Master Sergeant Jonathan Dunbar from Texas, who was killed in the same attack. I welcome the fact that all British military personnel involved have returned home safely from this mission. The attack in Douma was an horrific attack on civilians using chemical weapons, part of a civil war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. Mr. Speaker, this statement serves as a reminder that the Prime Minister is accountable to this Parliament, not to the whims of the US President. We clearly need a War Powers Act in this country to transform a now broken convention into a legal obligation. Her predecessor came to this House to seek authority for military action in Libya and in Syria in 2015, and the House had a vote over Iraq in 2003. There is no more serious issue than the life and death matters of military action. It is right that Parliament has the power to support or stop the government from taking planned military action. And, Mr. Speaker, the BBC reports that the Prime Minister argued for the bombing to be brought forward to avoid parliamentary scrutiny. Will she today confirm or deny those reports? I believe, Mr. Speaker, the action was legally questionable. And on Saturday,
I just urge members to calm down, because in my experience, some of the members who shout from a sedentary position then also entertain the fanciful idea that they might be called to ask a question. And I wish to disabuse them of that idea. The Prime Minister was heard in an atmosphere of respectful quiet and order, and that will happen for the Leader of the Opposition as well. No ifs, no buts, no sneers, no exceptions. That is the position. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the action was legally questionable, and on Saturday, the United Nations Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, said as much, reiterating that all countries must act in line with the United Nations Charter, which states action must be in self-defence or be authorised by the United Nations Security Council. The Prime Minister has assured us that the Attorney-General had given clear legal advice approving the action. I hope the Prime Minister will now publish this advice in full today. The summary note references the disputed humanitarian intervention doctrine, but even against this, the government fails its own tests. The overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe due to the civil war in Syria is absolutely indisputable. But the Foreign Secretary said yesterday these strikes would have no bearing on the civil war. And the Prime Minister has reiterated that today by saying this is not what these military strikes were about. And Mr. Speaker, does, for example, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen entitle other countries to arrogate to themselves the right to bomb Saudi airfields or their positions in Yemen, especially given their use of banned cluster bombs and white phosphorus? Mr. Speaker, 3 United Nations agencies said in January that Yemen was the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So will the Prime Minister today commit to ending support to the Saudi bombing campaign and arms sales to Saudi Arabia? On the mission itself, what assessment has the government made of the impact of bombing related military facilities where the regime is assessed to store chemical weapons? What impact on the local people of chemicals being released into the local environment? News footage shows both journalists and local people in the rubble without any protective clothing. Why does the Prime Minister believe these missile strikes will deter future chemical attacks? As the Prime Minister will be aware, there were US strikes in 2017 in the wake of the use of chemical weapons in Khan Shaykhun, for which the UN OPCW team held the Assad regime to be responsible. In relation to the airstrikes against Bazai and Himshinsar facilities, the Prime Minister will be aware that the OPCW carried out inspections on both those facilities in 2017 and concluded, I quote, that the inspection team did not observe any activities inconsistent with obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Can the Prime Minister advise the House? Does she believe the OPCW were wrong in that assessment, or does she have separate intelligence that the nature of those activities has changed within the last 5 months? And in the light of the Chilcot inquiry, does she agree with a key recommendation about the importance of strengthening the checks and assessment on intelligence information when it is used to make the case for government policies? Given that neither the UN nor the OPCW has yet investigated the Douma attack, it is clear that diplomatic and non-military means have not been fully exhausted. While much suspicion rightly points to the Assad government, chemical weapons have been used by other groups in the conflict. For example, Jaish al-Islam, which was reported to have used gas in Aleppo in 2016, amongst other groups. It is now vitally important that the OPCW inspectors who arrived in Damascus on Saturday are allowed to do their work and publish their report into their findings and report to the United Nations Security Council. They must be allowed to complete their inspections without hindrance. And I hope the UK will put all diplomatic pressure on Russia and Syria and other influential states to ensure they're able to access the site in Douma. The bigger question must be that during the Syrian conflict, over 400,000 Syrians are estimated to have died in the conflict, and the vast majority by conventional weapons, as the Prime Minister indicated. The UN estimates that 13.5 million Syrians are in need of humanitarian assistance, and there are over 5 million refugees. It's more important than ever that we take concrete steps to halt and finally end the suffering. Acting through the UN, the Prime Minister should now take a diplomatic lead to negotiate a pause in this abhorrent conflict. This means engaging with all parties that are involved in the conflict, including Iran, Israel, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and the US, to ensure there is an immediate ceasefire. We have, Mr. Speaker, the grotesque spectacle of a wider geopolitical battle being waged by proxy, with the Syrian people used as pawns by all sides. Our first priority must be the safety and security of the Syrian people, which is best served by de-escalating this conflict so that aid can get in. So will the Prime Minister now embark, as I hope she will, on a renewed diplomatic effort to try to bring an end to this conflict, as she indicated in the latter part of her statement? The Prime Minister states that diplomatic processes did not work. This is not exactly true. The initiative negotiated by John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov led to the destruction of 600 tons of chemical weapons overseen by the OPCW. No one, Mr. Speaker, disputes that such diplomatic processes are difficult and imperfect, but that should not stop us from continuing diplomatic efforts. The refugee crisis places a responsibility on all countries. Hundreds of unaccompanied children remain in Europe, and the UK has yet to take even the small numbers it was committed to through the Dubs Amendment. I hope that today the government will now increase its commitment to take additional Syrian refugees. Will the Prime Minister make that commitment today?
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I can start off by responding to the comments that the Leader of the Opposition has made on the Syrian conflict more generally, because everybody in this House recognises the nature of the conflict and the impacts that it has had on the Syrian people. The millions of people who have been displaced either within Syria or to countries in the surrounding region. We have, as the United Kingdom, as I said in my statement, we are now the second biggest bilateral donor to Syrian refugees in the region at almost £2.5 billion. We've been very clear that we believe we can help more people by giving that aid in the region, and we have been able to support hundreds of thousands of children in the region by the aid that we have given to them. We will continue to do that and continue to support and continue to be grateful for all that is being done, particularly by Turkey, the Lebanon and Jordan, to support refugees in the region. This is a significant task for those countries, and we are supporting them in that effort. I also said, the Right Honourable Gentleman also asked me to launch a new diplomatic effort. As I said in my statement, we will indeed be continuing the work in relation to this wider issue of the conflict in Syria. That means, as I said, continuing the fight against Daesh and concluding the fight against Daesh. It means our humanitarian work, as I have said, and continuing to press for humanitarian access. And it also means supporting the international efforts to reinvigorate the process to deliver a long-term political solution in Syria. But it is necessary for all parties to be willing to come together to ensure that they can and to discuss and develop a long-term solution for Syria. Now, let me come on to the specific strikes that took place at the weekend and the issue of chemical weapons. The right honourable gentleman asked about the legal basis. We have published the legal basis for our action. And I've been very clear, I went through the arguments in my statement. This is about the alleviation of humanitarian suffering. That is a legal basis that has been used by governments of all colours. It was used, as I said, in 1991 and 1992. It was also used by the Labour government to justify intervention in Kosovo as part of the NATO intervention. He refers to other areas of conflict in the world. Can I just say to him, what sets this apart particularly is the use of chemical weapons. This is about alleviating the suffering that would come from the use of chemical weapons. But I believe it is also important, and in this country's interest, and the interests of other countries around the world, that we do re-establish the international norm that the use of chemical weapons is prohibited. Absolutely. We cannot allow a situation to develop where countries and people think that the use of chemical weapons has been allowed to become normalised. And that is important for us all. He talks about the OPCW and about the intervention, their investigation in Duma. As I said in my statement, the problem is they are being stopped from their investigation in Duma. The regime and the Russians are preventing them from doing that. And moreover, again, the regime has reportedly been attempting to conceal the evidence by searching evacuees from Duma to ensure that they are not taking out of the region samples that could be tested elsewhere. And a wider operation to conceal the facts of the attack is underway, supported by the Russians. He talks about other groups that have, and the possibility of chemical weapons being used by other groups. As I pointed out in my statement, it is understood that these chemical weapons were delivered by barrel bombs. Barrel bombs are normally dropped from helicopters. There is the evidence that I cited in relation to regime helicopter activity in Duma on the date in question. And it is not the case that the groups that he has referred to have access to the helicopters and barrel bombs that will be able to ensure to deliver such a chemical weapons attack. I think it is clear, and it was on that basis that the government decided to act together with the United States and France. And I think it is important that this was a joint international effort that took place in relation to these strikes. These strikes were carefully targeted. A proper analysis was done to ensure that they were targeted at sites that were relevant to the chemical weapons capability of the regime. We did this to alleviate further human suffering. We targeted it on chemical weapons capability of the regime to degrade and deter the willingness of the regime to use chemical weapons in future. And I continue to believe it was the right thing to do.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I fully support the proportionate, targeted action that we have taken against these sites, and I hope the government would consider similar action again in future if anyone is so foolish as to repeat chemical weapons attacks. We can all debate these matters, but it takes a real Prime Minister to actually face up to the grave responsibility. But on the question of the parliamentary role, I think the Prime Minister was not relying on the archaic, narrow interpretation of the royal prerogative, which no government has invoked in this country for over 50 years. They've always come to Parliament for debate and votes, if possible, on any military action. And she says there was a problem of time, but surely once President Trump had announced to the world what he was proposing, a widespread debate was taking place everywhere, including many MPs in the media, but no debate in Parliament. So would she consider setting up, once the immediate issues are over, a cross-party commission of some kind to set out precisely what the role of Parliament is in modern times in the use of military power against another state, and what exceptions, if any, there can be to the usual rule that the government needs parliamentary approval for taking grave actions of this kind.
Can I first of all thank my right honourable and learned friend for the comments that he's made about the action that was taken in Syria by the US, the UK and France. He refers to the parliamentary position. The decision to act was taken on the basis that, first of all, obviously an effort was made in the United Nations Security Council to put forward a resolution and to get that passed that would have enabled investigation and accountability for these chemical weapons attacks to be determined. That was vetoed by the Russians, so that it was not possible to follow that diplomatic route. And the timing was such that enabled proper planning to take place so that this was a targeted and effective set of strikes, that it was done in a timely fashion, and also that it maintained the operational security of our armed forces. And any Prime Minister who commits any of our armed forces into action of this sort must have a care for their safety and their security in doing so. Can I also refer my right honourable and learned friend to the written ministerial statement in 2016 on the War Powers Convention, which said at the end of it the following: after careful consideration, the Government has decided that it will not be codifying the Convention in law or by resolution of the House in order to retain the ability of this and future governments and the armed forces to protect the security and interests of the UK in circumstances that we cannot predict, and to avoid such decisions becoming subject to legal action. It continues to say we will continue to ensure that Parliament is kept informed of significant major operations and deployments of the armed forces. That is what I have done today. I have come to Parliament with a statement on the action that took place. As I said in my statement, Parliament will hold me to account for the decision that has been taken.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on the sad demise of Sergeant Tonroe and pass on condolences to his family and friends? Can I also thank the Prime Minister for the phone call ahead of the engagement at the weekend, as well as advance sight of her statement today? All of us, I think, in this House have an absolute revulsion on the use of chemical weapons, and we need to work here and internationally to make sure that we remove the scourge of chemical weapons from the landscape in Syria and indeed in elsewhere. The Government now seems to have accepted that this House needed time to debate Syria. But why have we had to wait for today? When the Prime Minister called a Cabinet meeting last week, she should have recalled Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister leads a minority government. As was the case with the action against Daesh in 2015, this only happened with parliamentary approval. It was perfectly possible for the House to have been recalled in advance of Saturday's morning's airstrikes. Why was this not done? And what does this mean for the PM's position if there are further chemical attacks in Syria? Will she continue to authorise military action without consulting and without the authorisation of Parliament? I'm glad to hear the Leader of the Opposition support our calls for a War Powers Act, because this is the best way to protect us from getting into this situation again. Mr. Speaker, has the Government learned nothing from the Chilcot Review? Once again, we have been dragged into military action with little regard for the humanitarian situation on the ground and no long-term strategic plan. The human suffering in Syria knows no bounds. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions fleeing for their lives, and 400,000 civilians still trapped in appalling conditions, deprived of food, medicine and basic aid. Over 13 million civilians in desperate need of humanitarian aid. Will the Prime Minister revisit the issue of refugees, particularly child refugees? We must do more than we have been doing. Why was action taken before international weapons inspectors completed their investigation? In February, the Prime Minister told me in this House that she was committed to finding a political solution for Syria. Why then did the UK not support Sweden's draft UN resolution calling for an international investigation into chemical stockpiles reportedly held by the Syrian regime? Mr. Speaker, is the PM as surprised and concerned as I am at the US President's language that the situation in Syria was mission accomplished? Who does she agree with, the US President or the UN Secretary-General, who, like most of us, is clear? There is no military solution to the crisis. The solution must be political.
Can I first of all say to the Right Honourable, he's raised a number of issues there. On the question of refugees, and particularly child refugees, and I recognise that this is an issue that has been of concern to members across this House for some time and has been raised in this chamber on a number of occasions. Obviously, we took the decision that we could help and support more children, more refugees in general, men and women as well as children, by acting in the region. And that is why we have, and as I've said, we've become the second biggest bilateral donor to the region. But we also took the decision that there were a number of refugees who are particularly vulnerable, who perhaps required particular medical support, who it was right to bring to the United Kingdom under our commitment on the Vulnerable Refugees Resettlement Scheme, which we have, Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, which we have been putting in place and continue to put in place. There are a number of other schemes that we're operating to bring refugees, children in particular, here to the United Kingdom. But we continue to ensure that we are supporting the greatest number possible of refugees by actually acting in region, and I think that continues to be what we should be doing. He asked me about the issue of Parliament, and I'm sure that he would recognise that it is the case that it is always necessary for the government to be able to act in those circumstances where decisions need to be taken, but to ensure that if a decision is taken which has not been discussed by Parliament, that an opportunity for Parliament to consider that, to discuss it, to ask questions on it is given at the first opportunity. That is exactly what we have done in this particular circumstance. We have also been as open as possible in terms of publishing the legal basis for which we have, on which we have taken this decision, and making information available to a number of parliamentarians on a Privy Council basis, and trying to ensure that we can provide the maximum possible briefing, commensurate, of course, with the fact that some of the intelligence that we have and have operated on is not intelligence that it is possible to share with Parliament. But we will be as open as possible with this Parliament. As I say, I will continue to answer questions from this Parliament on this issue.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, may I say to my right honourable friend that, given the nature of her narrow target of stopping Syrians using chemical weapons further, and of the need to take swift action, I commend her for taking that, notwithstanding the fact that others have criticised her for not coming to Parliament. Coming to Parliament is a must, and the Prime Minister has done that today and will do it later on as well. But can I also raise the issue that the Russians and the Syrians are blocking the OPCW from going in to the target area, and I understand there's a lot of clean-up and change taking place while that block is taking place at the same time. So I have a simple question to ask my right honourable friend. Given the confusion of some who are a bit uncertain about who is the greatest threat to world peace, does she think that it is Russia or America?
Well, can I say to my right honourable friend that I think people are seeing from the actions that Russia has taken in support of the Syrian regime, but as my right honourable friend has pointed out, what we are seeing in Syria at the moment in relation to Duma is that efforts are being made to ensure that it is not possible for the inspectors to be OPCW to be able to go in and to ascertain the truth of what happened in Duma. We took a decision, we assessed together with our allies, and the assessment was agreed amongst the three parties that took place in these strikes, that all the evidence that we had seen from open source reporting, the reporting of NGOs, the reporting of the World Health Organization, that this was a chemical weapons attack, and as I've indicated, a number of pieces of information and intelligence that showed that it was highly likely this was undertaken by the Syrian regime. But my right honourable friend is right. Actually, more could have been done by the OPCW if Russia had not vetoed the resolution in the United Nations Security Council. it would be possible to make greater efforts on the ground to establish now what had happened in Duma if Russia and the regime were not blocking the opportunity for the OPCW to go to the site, and if efforts were not being made by the regime to ensure that material from the site is not available for that sort of analysis. It is quite clear that every effort is being made, and this is why I pointed this out in my statement in relation to comments the Leader of the Opposition had made. It is perfectly clear that Russia is preventing, is stopping, is blocking our opportunities to ensure that we can properly hold to account those responsible for chemical weapons attacks in Syria.
Sir Vincent Cable.
I also regret, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister did not seek the prior approval of Parliament, especially as at least some of her arguments are compelling. But can I ask a question of the member for Rushcliffe, which he didn't answer, is that if the Syrian regime is now foolish enough to use its residual stocks to attack other holdouts like Idlib, does the Prime Minister intend to order fresh strikes, or is it, in the words of President Trump, a one-off operation and mission accomplished?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that this was a limited and targeted set of strikes that took place between the United Kingdom, the United States and France. The intention of those strikes and the targets were carefully chosen. The intention was to degrade the chemical weapons capability of the Syrian regime and to deter its willingness to use those chemical weapons. Nobody should be in any doubt of our resolve to ensure that we cannot see a situation where the use of chemical weapons is normalised.
Sir Michael Fallon.
Would the Prime Minister accept that the public well understand that when our forces need to act quickly and decisively and safely in concert with our allies, it must be right to authorise strikes without giving notice? Is it further not clear that if the use of chemical weapons goes completely unchallenged, we are going to see dictators in other countries using these awful weapons to suppress opposition?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for his comment? And in fact, when I quoted from the written ministerial statement in 2016 earlier, it was in fact the written ministerial statement, I believe, in my right honourable friend's name, where it was clear. It said, we must ensure the ability of our armed forces to act quickly and decisively and to maintain the security of their operations is not compromised in observing the Convention. And it's important that we are able to do that, and I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This was clearly a vile attack by Assad on his own people, and we have a responsibility to consider how to respond whilst also not escalating global conflict. But Parliament has considered these kinds of complex issues before. We have voted for and against military action. We have got things right and got things wrong, and so too has the executive. And the Prime Minister and her cabinet appear today to not just be arguing about the circumstances of last week, but also to be rejecting the entire principle of consulting, debating and voting in Parliament in advance of military action. Given the importance of us pioneering democratic values across the world, can she clarify her position on this and say how important she thinks it is for Parliament to decide issues of war and peace?
Can I say to the right honourable lady, it is not a question of the government rejecting that. It is, if I can return again to the written ministerial statement, which observed that the Cabinet Manual states that in 2011 the government acknowledged that a convention had developed in Parliament, that before troops were committed the House of Commons should have an opportunity to debate the matter, and said that it proposed to observe that convention except where there was an emergency and such action would not be appropriate. It then goes on subsequently to refer to references after that, but says, as I have just said in response to my right honourable friend, the member for Sevenoaks, in observing the Convention, we must ensure that the ability of our armed forces to act quickly and decisively and to maintain the security of their operations is not compromised. And where it is the case that the government takes a decision and acts without a debate in Parliament, as has happened in this, on this occasion, it is right that I come to Parliament at the first opportunity to explain that decision and to give members of this House an opportunity to question that and to hold me and the government to account.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can only imagine the burden on the Prime Minister's shoulders as she took the onerous decision she took. I can only say that from the other side, receiving orders like that is about the most sobering thing you can ever get. May I congratulate her on having taken action that I believe to be not only legitimate but right and indeed urgent. And I congratulate her and her colleagues and indeed our international partners in standing together on this. May I also ask her, however, if she will reinforce the efforts of the Foreign Office, because few have been shouldering the burden as heavily as Karen Pierce in the United Nations, although others in our diplomatic network have done so. Would she not agree with me that the role of the Foreign Office is to promote the aims and interests of our government and our people who we are here to represent, and not to wait for a veto and the order that Moscow says no?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend that it must be the UK government that determines UK foreign policy, and we must not hand over our foreign policy to a Russian veto. It is absolutely essential that we determine our foreign policy, and that the Foreign Office, of course, is a key part of delivering that.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. There are many who support the principle of humanitarian protection, what it achieved in Kosovo and Sierra Leone, and what its absence cost in Rwanda and indeed in Syria. And of course, we must uphold the international prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. But as someone who supported military action against Daesh in Syria in the vote in December 2015, may I say gently to the Prime Minister that she should have come first to the House before committing our forces to action. And therefore, may I ask her to give us an assurance that in the event, heaven forbid, that President Assad chooses to use chemical weapons against innocent civilians once again, that she will come to Parliament first, that she will share such evidence as she can with us, as she has done today, and that she will trust Parliament to decide what is to be done.
Say to the right honourable gentleman, as I set out the basis on which we took this decision in the statement that I have just made, and I recognise the importance and significance of Parliament and Parliament being able to make its views known on these issues. But it is also important that the government is able to act in there will always be circumstances in which it's important for the government to be able to act and for the operational security of our armed forces to be able to do so without that debate having taken place in Parliament. There will be circumstances where that is the case. The government has consistently set that out. As I said, if those are the circumstances, then it's right that the Prime Minister comes to Parliament at the earliest opportunity. But in relation to the reference he's made to potential future action, as I said in response to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Liberal Democrats, this was a targeted attack. It was targeted on the degrading of the chemical weapons capability of the Syrian regime, and it was undertaken. We now look alongside that to undertake international work and diplomatic and political channels to ensure that we reinforce the international norm of not using chemical weapons. But nobody should be in any doubt, I think, about our resolve that should be there to ensure that we do not see a situation developing where the use of chemical weapons is normalised.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Leader of the Opposition persists on behalf of the Labour Party in changing its previous adherence to the previous rule of international law, justifying taking unilateral action in the event of there being a humanitarian necessity, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the consequence of that is going to be that any tyrant, megalomaniac, person intent on carrying out genocide, if they have the support of an amoral state within the Security Council, we'll be able to conduct that genocide with total impunity. Even if it was within our power to act to prevent it. And does she agree with me that in those circumstances, far from upholding the international rules-based system The reality is that it would be dead.
Can I say to my right honourable and learned friend that I absolutely agree with him. He is absolutely right. If we were to say that we were only prepared to act when we had the support of the United Nations, given that there is, as we have seen in this circumstance, a member of the UN Security Council who is willing repeatedly to veto the ability to investigate these issues, then anybody, any tyrant around the world could determine that actually they could act with impunity and they could use these weapons with impunity. We must not allow that. The use of these chemical weapons must be stopped.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Associate my honourable and right honourable friends with the Prime Minister's remarks on the passing of Sergeant Tunro, and his courage and valour is another example of the courage and valour of all our servicemen and women as exemplified in Syria at the weekend. Can I thank her for her call with me prior to the action on Saturday morning, and thank her for her statement today, and the cogent and well-argued nature of that statement addresses the challenges of these difficult times in stark contrast to the contribution of the Leader of the Opposition in this House today. And given the fact that this is limited and targeted action, given the fact that diplomacy was tried and was unable, sadly, to succeed, the Prime Minister is utterly justified in the action that she has taken. And she should have the support of every right-thinking member of this House in upholding international law and defending the national interests of the United Kingdom.
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman, and he is absolutely right. We undertook this action because we believed it was the right thing to do. It was in our national interest, and I believe it is important that all of us across this House recognise the need to uphold the international rules-based order and do what we can to ensure that we maintain that rules-based order.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
I welcome the calm and measured assessment of the Prime Minister, as I suspect do a considerable number of honourable members on the other side of the House. She mentioned the year 2011. Now, bearing in mind what happened in Libya after the House retrospectively approved air action in 2011, namely the toppling of the regime, will she give us an absolute and unequivocal guarantee that the use of airstrikes now, specifically, as she says, to degrade and deter chemical atrocities, will absolutely not be allowed to lead to the Royal Air Force becoming, in effect, the air arm of the jihadist-led rebel forces in Syria. The two roles are and should be held to be entirely separate.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. They are separate. This was about the degrading of the chemical weapons capability. It was not about regime change. It was not about an intervention in the civil war in Syria. It was about the use of chemical weapons and the prevention of future humanitarian suffering.
Liz Kendall.
There are no easy solutions to the appalling humanitarian crisis and civil war in Syria. But Assad's repeated use of chemical weapons against his own people in violation of international law cannot go unanswered. Yeah. Can the Prime Minister tell us what her assessment is of Assad's chemical weapons capability after these strikes, and what further and urgent humanitarian action she is planning to protect Syrian civilians?
Can I say to the honourable lady, can I thank her for her words and say that we continue to complete the assessments of the action, but the assessment of the strikes that took place in the early hours of Saturday morning are that those strikes were successful, that they will have degraded the chemical weapons capability of the Syrian regime. But we will continue to ensure that we are encouraging humanitarian access to those people in Syria who require that access. Again, there have been attempts through the United Nations to encourage that access and so forth, and sometimes those have not been successful, but we will continue to press because we believe it is important that we can ensure that support is available to those people in Syria who need it.
Justine Greening.
As the former Secretary of State for International Development, the harrowing stories that I heard
from refugees, Syrian refugees, men, women and children, will stay with me for the rest of my life. Does she agree with me that on their behalf we simply cannot turn a blind eye to this breach of international law, and there will be times when action is urgent and must be taken? And does she agree with me we cannot also allow countries like Russia and Syria to simply dictate our foreign policy through barring action?
Absolutely agree with my right honourable friend. She has, as she said in her former role, she will have had the opportunity to speak with and hear from Syrian refugees about their experiences. I think nobody who has seen the pictures or read the descriptions of what happened in Douma can think anything other than that this was an absolutely barbaric act that took place, and that it is right that we do act in response to that and the continued use of chemical weapons, because this was about the continued use of chemical weapons and the potential for those weapons to be used in future.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
The sight of children and adults suffering from the effects of chemical weapons cries out to all humanity for a humane response. But planning for war without equally robust planning for peace is anything but humane. Conventional and chemical weapons are indiscriminately horrific. In what way will this weekend's strikes prevent children from monstrous attacks in future?
What we have undertaken is a limited and targeted set of strikes alongside our allies in the United States and France. The purpose of those strikes, and as I've just indicated in response to a previous question, our assessment is that those were successful, was to degrade the capability of the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons, and it is that degrading of their capability, but also those strikes were intended to deter their willingness to use chemical weapons, and it is that degrading of their capability which we believe will have an impact and will help to alleviate and ensure that we do not see the same humanitarian suffering in future.
The Nicholas Soames.
Well, my right honourable friend will agree that the use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances, is illegal, contrary to all the laws of war, and utterly reprehensible. And would she therefore confirm that the government will, at a later date, seek the arraignment at an international court of those who instigate these vile acts, whoever they may be?
Can I say to my right honourable friend that he is absolutely right about the illegality of the use of chemical weapons and the impact of the use of chemical weapons, and we believe that those who are responsible should be held to account.
Chris Leslie.
The Prime Minister that pinpointing and degrading Assad's chemical weapons was necessary and appropriate, and that intervening to save civilians from future gas attacks, while not without risk, was absolutely the right thing to do. And would the Prime Minister also agree that a policy of inaction also would have severe consequences, and that those who would turn a blind eye, who would do nothing in pursuit of some moral high ground, should also be held accountable for once today as well?
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his comments, and I agree with him. I think we have to look, many people focus on the impact of action, but actually inaction would have given a message that these chemical weapons could continue to be used by the Syrian regime and indeed by others with impunity, and we cannot allow that to happen. The use of these weapons must be stopped.
Priti Patel.
There are no words to describe the appalling nature of the humanitarian disaster confronting Syria, which is why I commend my right honourable friend for the very strong action that she has shown, and also the support she's given to the Syrian people. Will my right honourable friend give an assurance that in the face of the abhorrent abuses perpetrated by the Assad regime, that she will continue to be a strong voice for the international rules-based system and show that Britain will not stand idly by when cruel weapons are used to murder innocent children and families?
Well, can I say to my right honourable friend, I absolutely agree with her. We will ensure that our voice is heard. And I think it is absolutely right. This is the right thing to do. It was in our national interest, but it's also important that we are standing up for that international rules-based order and that we continue to do so.
Ben Bradshaw.
Britain was absolutely right with France and America to take this long overdue action in response to Assad's proven and repeated use of chemical weapons. His regime and the Kremlin have lied and lied again since 2013 on his continued development of his chemical weapons programme and their continued use. So will she reassure this House that if this does not prove to be a sufficient deterrent, she and our allies will not hesitate to act again, but I do urge her, in those circumstances, to come to this House and seek Parliament's consent first.
I say to the right honourable gentleman, he's absolutely right to refer to proven and repeated use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. And as I said earlier in response to a number of other questions, nobody should doubt our resolve. Nobody should be in any doubt about our resolve to ensure that we the alleviation of humanitarian suffering by dealing with this issue of the use of chemical weapons, but also our resolve to ensure that the use of chemical weapons is not normalised.
Sir Edward Lee.
The Prime Minister was indeed heard in respectful silence because her moderate and determined and sensible attitude deserves respect from this House. But may I ask a question on behalf of the persecuted Christians of the Middle East, who will face further persecution if it is believed that their sponsors in the West are taking sides in this civil war? So will she assure us that not just in terms of this airstrike, but generally, we are no longer in favour of regime change, we do not take sides, we are only on the side of peace? And can she look me in the eye and say that whilst we, backbenchers, can of course not have access to intelligence, she does, and having had that access, she is absolutely clear in her own mind that beyond reasonable doubt the regime was responsible for this attack?
Well, can I, on the first point that my honourable friend has raised, can I say that I recognise the concerns about persecuted Christians in this region, and indeed this is a matter which we're discussing with the Foreign Office, how we can look at this issue of persecuted Christians, but also actually other religious groups who find themselves persecuted in wherever that might be, and including in this region. And I can give my honourable friend the absolute assurance that from the intelligence that I have seen, from the analysis I have seen, from the assessments that I have heard, I am in absolutely no doubt that the Syrian regime was responsible for this attack in Douma.
Caroline Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has said that the legal basis relies on there having been no practicable alternative to the use of force. Further to that, can she confirm exactly when the UK identified Himshin Shah as a chemical weapons storage facility, and when they identified the chemical research facility at Barzeh as a chemical weapons research centre, when this information was reported to the OPCW, and whether the UK has asked the OPCW to inspect both sites?
I have to say to the Honourable Lady, we are very keen, we've been very clear that we would like it to be possible for the OPCW to investigate sites in Syria and for there to be proper accountability, proper identification of the chemical weapons and proper accountability for the use of those chemical weapons. This is, well, can I say to the Honourable Lady that last Tuesday in the United Nations Security Council there was a proposal, there was going to be a proposal, a resolution, that would have enabled the reintroduction of a proper investigative mechanism to look at the use of chemical weapons and what chemical weapons were available in Syria and held by the regime, their capabilities, and to be able to ascertain accountability for those chemical weapons. That draft resolution was vetoed by Russia.
Mr. Richard Benyon.
Would my right honourable friend agree that in the coming days, weeks and months, the image that we must hold in our minds is of children coughing up their lungs? And would she understand that many of us, on all sides in this House, want an executive, when it's planning a limited operation like this, to act, and in the full knowledge that if it doesn't, and tries to labour before the House at great length, we'll put at risk not only the operation, possibly the risk to our airmen, and the complications of working with our partners.
Can I say I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend, and I think he's absolutely right. When we think about this issue, we should hold in our minds the horrific suffering of children and others in Duma as a result of the use of these chemical weapons.
Stella Creasy.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister just said that we should hold in our eyes the images of the suffering of those children, the human cost of the consequences of Assad and their Russian backers using chemical weapons against their people and it becoming normalised. But we know this is not the first time. So with that in mind, can I beg the Prime Minister to rethink her approach to those Syrians who have fled to Europe? Because they are the same people fleeing this horror. They are the people who needed a safe haven, and with 40% of those in the Greek camps Syrian, a third of them children, and only one Home Office official for the entirety of Greece to deal with the issue, do they not deserve more direct support from us too?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that the Home Office has been looking very carefully at this issue. We have changed the arrangements that we have in order to ensure that there's a wider group of children that will be fall within the remit of the proposals that we have for bringing refugee children into the United Kingdom. There are a number of ways in which we are ensuring that we do accommodate and offer shelter and security to refugees from Syria, including refugee children. But as I said earlier, we must also recognise the many millions of people from Syria who have been displaced from their country, both within their country and from their country. And I think it is right that we look to ensure that we can provide as much support as possible for them, and that is best done by supporting them in region.
Nicky Morgan.
Mr. Speaker, can I offer my support to the Prime Minister both for the action that was taken at the weekend but also to her stance on Parliament. She's absolutely right that members of Parliament are there to scrutinise the decisions of the Executive, but it is the Prime Minister's right with her government to make the difficult decision that she did at the end of last week. Can I ask her about a line in her statement? She talks about continuing to work with international partners on tough economic action against those involved with the production or dissemination of chemical weapons. Can I suggest to her that that should extend to those who are complicit in the use of chemical weapons, those who turn a blind eye to the use of chemical weapons, and those who veto resolutions of the United Nations? I'm talking about much tougher sanctions on Russia and Russian citizens.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for her contribution and for the specific proposals that she has made. We will be looking very carefully at what further levers can be used, and as I said, I'm pleased that the Foreign Affairs Council in the European Foreign Affairs Council has today agreed that it is willing to look at what further measures could be taken, but I will certainly take on board and note the specific suggestions my right honourable friend has made.
Order. It's always very good to be able to call a fairly new and young member, particularly when that member is celebrating her birthday. Paula Sheriff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All of us in this House agree that after the appalling scenes that we saw in Duma, there is a desperate need to provide humanitarian relief and medical care to the civilians who have fled the city and also to those who have remained. So can the Prime Minister tell us what action she has taken to that end?
Well, can I first of all wish the Honourable Lady a very happy birthday. As I said, we will be continuing to work with our international partners, both to look at what more we can be doing in terms of our humanitarian support, but also in pressing for humanitarian access. As the Honourable Lady and others will know, this has been one of the problems. Time and time again, there have been groups of people within Syria who have been suffering as a result of the conflict, for whom it has not been possible to get that humanitarian access. We will continue to press at the international level for that access.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
On Sunday, the Leader of the Opposition on the Mar show said that our exports that go to Saudi Arabia end up somewhere in very bad hands in Syria and other places. The Leader of the Opposition has rightly called for evidence to support and for the government to be satisfied about this intervention. If you, on the one hand, demand evidence and then repeat malicious gossip for which there is not only no evidence but is contradicted by the NGOs who are specialists in this area, you are guilty of very poor double standards.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend.
Oh yes, on the subject of new young members early in their parliamentary careers, let's hear from Mr. Barry Shearman.
Mr. Speaker, it's not my birthday, but I was born on the week in London on the weekend of the worst weekend of the Blitz.
August 19th.
And my next-door neighbour's family were killed and the 2 children died that night. So when I hear of a tyrant killing children, I want action. I have no criticism of the Prime Minister. I have one problem and demur. I am a passionate pro-American. I have been all the time I've been in this House. I see it as a beacon, I've seen it as a beacon of our democratic world. But I have to say to thee, I was in United Nations all last week when all this happened on different business. And the conversations there were quite chilling in the sense many of us, passionate pro-Americans, couldn't remember a time when we were seriously worried about American leadership and the American president at the same time as we didn't trust Putin and his horrible gang. We need a Prime Minister and European leaders to show the way in these troubled times. Does he agree with me?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman... Can I say to the honourable gentleman, I think what he has seen from the fact that the United Kingdom and France came together with the United States in this action, that actually there is leadership being shown in Europe on this matter, and we will continue to work with France, as I said, on the international grouping that they have put together in relation to the prohibition of use of chemical weapons, and I think it is clear that Europe has taken a stance on this and has shown the way and the importance of the international rules-based order.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Had she first sought our consent, with what detail might she have persuaded us without fundamentally compromising our intelligence-gathering capability?
My right honourable friend, I think, has put his finger on a particular aspect of this issue. It is not possible to bring all the intelligence through to this House. It is not possible to make all of that intelligence public. And sometimes, actually, more information can be made available after the event than in advance of the event, because we do need to maintain the operational security of our armed forces.
Laura Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't expecting you to call me then, so thank you. For those of us who have been trying to follow President Trump's tweets over the last week, I can't be the only person who has found it extremely difficult to keep track if he was for military action or against military action. So I wondered, can the Prime Minister tell us at what point the President instructed her that military action would be taken?
The answer to the honourable lady's question is at no point at all. I took this decision. I took this decision because I believed it was the right thing to do. It was in our national interest. And it is a decision that should be, I believe, supported by anybody who recognises that we need to re-establish the international norms in relation to the use and the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons.
Mr. Damien Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister deserves the support she's getting from across the House for the action she's taken, just as it's had support from democracies, not just in Europe, but all around the world. Isn't the problem for those who are advocating any and every type of action except military action is that this action by the Assad regime was part of a repeated pattern of barbaric use of chemical weapons, and that therefore, if she and our allies had not taken military action, we would have sent the message that using chemical weapons was no big deal, thus encouraging further use of them on innocent civilians around the world.
Well, can I say to my right honourable friend, he's absolutely right. It was important, I believe, that we took action because what we saw in Douma was part of a repeated pattern of behaviour by the Syrian regime, and it was precisely in order to degrade their capability to prevent further humanitarian suffering that we took this action.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I accept that the Prime Minister had no real easy options in making this consideration, but given that members of the Security Council are now acting out with the norms that she says she's acted to defend, because ultimately if the veto is dead for Moscow, it's dead for London, how exactly does she plan to restore the order and reform the National Security Council?
Well, we will continue to operate through the United Nations Security Council, but we will continue to make the arguments for ensuring that every country recognises the importance of ensuring that we maintain the prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. As I said earlier, the strikes that took place were about degrading the Syrian regime's capability. But I believe they should have given a message to others as well, that we will not accept the use of chemical weapons with impunity.
And Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I begin by congratulating the Prime Minister on her leadership and on her sheer guts to take a decisive decision over the weekend to deal with Assad and his friends. Now, in the event of a retaliatory cyber attack from Russia, attacking our NHS or any other vital part of our infrastructure, would she then, working with our NATO allies, consider invoking Article 5?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, he's raised the issue of potential cyber attacks. Of course, we have done a great deal as a government to reinforce our capability of identifying and dealing with any potential cyber attacks that take place. The establishment of the National Cyber Security Centre has been a very important development from the United Kingdom's point of view in enabling us to deal with this issue of cyber attacks. And of course, we always remain on the alert for any such attacks taking place, and we continue to enhance our capability to deal with them.
Gapes. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister referred to the actions of previous governments. Can I remind her, and also the Right Honourable Member for Islington North, that it was a Labour government with Robin Cook as Foreign Secretary which carried out airstrikes in Iraq under Operation Desert Fox in 1998 without a UN resolution, that it was a Labour government that restored President Kaba in Sierra Leone without a UN resolution, that it was a Labour government that stopped the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo without a UN resolution, and that there is a long-standing and noble tradition on these benches supporting humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. Decisions have been taken by governments of all colours to take action where we believed it was in the national interest and where we believed it was important in order to prevent humanitarian suffering. And as he has said, there has been a long-standing tradition and proud tradition in the Labour Party of being willing to step up to the plate and take those decisions when it is necessary to do so.
John Barron.
Decisions are always difficult, and Prime Ministers must retain the leeway to commit armed forces in extremis. But I hope she will also understand that many are concerned, given our previous track record of errors in previous interventions and in Syria, that government should be properly scrutinised before committing troops. Given the possibility of future interventions in Syria, under what circumstances does the Prime Minister think it right to come to this place and consult before committing armed forces?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I absolutely understand the concern that he and other members of this House will have in relation to the role of Parliament, particularly given the experience, and I know this is an issue on which my honourable friend has been concerned in the past and continues to be concerned. I think it is important. It isn't, as I said earlier in response to the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Pontefract, that we're saying no debate should take place in Parliament, but simply that I think that does need to be a recognition of the fact that there will be occasions when it is important to act in a timeline and with the consideration of the operational security of our armed forces that means that it is not possible to have that debate in advance of a decision being taken.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker. One of the last discussions I had with our murdered former colleague Joe Cox was on the need to protect civilians in Syria. And given that we can neither be in a situation where we fire and forget, we can neither be in a situation where we simply debate and talk and forget. And therefore, can I ask the Prime Minister what is her comprehensive political, diplomatic and humanitarian strategy to protect civilians in Syria, not just one-off military actions? And while she's at it, will she agree with me that councils around this country, including Vale of Glamorgan in my own constituency, need to do much more to support the resettlement of Syrian refugees under the resettlement programme, which they are currently not doing?
Certainly. Can I say to the honourable gentleman that I think there are, if I may, there are two areas in which I would say we will undertake this diplomatic and political process. The first is in relation to the use of chemical weapons, and it is following up on the military action that has taken place within a number of international fora. As I've said, there have already been obviously comments coming out of the European Foreign Affairs Council, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and we will be discussing this with a number of leaders around the world as to how we can re-establish the international norm prohibiting the use of chemical weapons. So that is one strand of activity we will undertake. The other is the full support we will continue to give to the United Nations process in trying to find a solution to what is happening in Syria. We support the Stefan de Mistura, the United Nations envoy's work that he is doing in that area. We hope that the Geneva process can be reignited and that we can see the parties coming together around the table to find a genuine solution. But it does mean not just all the parties in Syria themselves, but actually the backers of the parties in Syria being willing to do that as well.
Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has argued that these airstrikes were illegal. But is it not true that the only illegal act which has taken place in this situation was the war crime, and it was a war crime, of using chemical weapons to murder families and children? And was the Prime Minister not entirely right to authorise these airstrikes to defend the principles of the Chemical Weapons Convention and, in so doing, to uphold international law?
I say to my honourable friend, he is absolutely right. What is illegal is the use of chemical weapons, and it is entirely right that we have acted.
Laura Pidcock.
Speaker, I haven't heard much clarity on this, so could the Prime Minister tell us if she was planning to use executive powers again with regard to military action in Syria in breach of commonly understood parliamentary protocol, which would have given the House a say in a matter of war? There is clear opposition from British people to airstrikes, and I think the public are right to be sceptical. So could the Prime Minister also explain how Friday's airstrikes have improved the safety and security of Syrian people practically, when we are aware that the bombing and violence is continuing unabated throughout the region?
To the honourable lady, I've answered, responded to a number of questions in relation to Parliament. On the second part of her question, she asks about what impact this will make. The strikes that took place were about degrading the chemical weapons capability of the Syrian regime. As I've said in answer to other questions, the assessment that we have made is that the strikes were successful. We continue to obviously build that picture, but that is our assessment of the strikes that have taken place. And it is by degrading their chemical weapons capability that we can have an impact and ensure that we are reducing the likelihood of the humanitarian suffering in the future.
Mr. David Jones.
The conflict in Syria has had the most serious impact on other nations in the region, not least upon countries friendly to the UK, such as Jordan, which has done so much to accommodate refugees from the fighting. Can my right honourable friend confirm that our regional allies have been kept fully informed of the action that we took over the last weekend, and that they will be similarly informed should any future action be necessary?
I can give that assurance to my right honourable friend. We have been, in fact, he specifically mentions Jordan. I spoke to His Majesty the King of Jordan on Saturday about this and about the support that the United Kingdom continues to give to Jordan, which is important. It is has a large number of refugees in Jordan, and I think it's absolutely right that we continue to support that country in providing for those refugees and in other ways.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, the policy paper on the UK government's legal position says that the UK is permitted under international law on an exceptional basis to take measures in order to alleviate overwhelming humanitarian suffering. But it doesn't cite any authority for that proposition. It doesn't quote the UN Charter. It doesn't refer to any Security Council resolution, nor to any international treaty of any kind. Can she tell us why that proposition is unvouched in the policy paper?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that the basis on which we undertook this action is one which has been accepted by governments previously. It's one under which previous action has been taken. And I believe it continues to be the right basis for ensuring that we can act to alleviate humanitarian suffering. I would have thought the alleviation of humanitarian suffering was something which should gain support from across this whole House.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, it is a historic reality that of the many hundreds of occasions in which this country has gone to war or committed troops, only 4 have been voted for prior to that occasion in this House, the most notable of them being when Tony Blair illegally committed our troops to war in 2003. Not a great precedent. So would the Prime Minister not agree with me? Would the Prime Minister not agree with me that she has the secret intelligence, she has the legal advice, she has the military advice to take that most awful and terrible of all decisions to commit our troops to war, and that by coming here looking for political top cover, rather than empowering Parliament, she's actually emasculating it?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I think the position that the government has taken on these matters, as set out in 2016, is absolutely clear, that we must retain the right to be able to commit our armed forces where it is necessary and right to do so in a timely fashion, without having a debate here in Parliament, but we recognise the significance of Parliament, the importance of Parliament, and if it is the case that a decision is taken without that prior consideration by Parliament, then the Prime Minister should come at the first possible opportunity to the House, which is what I've done.
Jay Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad that we are finally debating this situation in Syria, but the Prime Minister could and should have recalled Parliament to discuss and vote on this last week. The heartbreaking and sickening images of these chemical attacks leave us in no doubt why so many Syrians have felt forced to take their children and flee their homes and their country. In the same circumstances, which of us would not do the same? But with deeper engagement comes greater responsibility. So does the Prime Minister recognise the jarring contrast between the humanitarian arguments she makes for this military action and her government's inhumane and inadequate approach to Syrian refugees, which has left vulnerable children stranded and alone?
I say to the Right Honourable Lady that we have been providing significant support to Syrian refugees since the start of this conflict. It is the biggest single humanitarian intervention that this country has made, a support that we are giving to Syrian refugees. We have been providing water, food, medical consultations for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees, and we continue to do so. I believe it is right that we continue to recognise the need of those people and that we continue to provide for it.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I sincerely thank my right honourable friend for making sure Britain stands up against these chemical weapons attacks. Can I ask my right honourable friend if she's seen the investigation in the Times newspaper on Saturday, which shows that a number of senior academics across universities, including Sheffield and Edinburgh, are disseminating extremist Assad propaganda. The Times describe it as an insult to the victims of the depraved regime and a stain on the reputation of the institutions which host its authors. Absolutely. Will she act to stop this extremism in our universities?
I have to confess to my honourable friend that I had not seen that particular report, and I will, of course, look at that particular report. There are a number of values that underpin our society. Of course, academic freedom is one of them. But I will certainly look at the instances that he has referred me to.
Emma Reynolds.
I regret that there was a parliamentary debate and vote on this military intervention. However, standing by and letting President Assad use chemical weapons against his own people would have been the wrong thing to do. To prevent the further deterioration of the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding and has been for the last 7 years in Syria, will the Prime Minister support President Macron's initiative to push for humanitarian corridors to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people?
We will be pressing for humanitarian access. The exact form in which that humanitarian access might occur, of course, might vary, but we will continue to press with our international allies for humanitarian access.
Leo Doherty.
I'm very grateful for the Prime Minister's robust action over the weekend. And given that this action has been legal, precise and timely, would she agree with me that those who seek to play politics around this issue by raising spurious legal questions do a great disservice to their office and also a grave disservice to the innocent civilians in Syria who have faced the horror of chemical attack?
Well, yes, I agree with my honourable friend, and if I can say to my honourable friend, I think from the contributions that have already been made, it is clear that across this House there is support for action being taken against the use of chemical weapons and in support of those who have been suffering so abominably from the action of the Syrian regime.
Mr. Kevin Jones.
The military action that took place was both correct and proportional in response to the horrific spectacle of women and children being gassed in their own homes in Ghouta. In terms of the military action, though, it is only part of the strategy. So could she expand a little bit further on what else will take place over the next few weeks in terms of the broader strategy, including the suggestion from the Honourable Member for Loughborough about economic sanctions against those who are supporting the Assad regime?
Yes, I mean, there are a variety of ways in which we will be pursuing further action on the international stage. We will be looking at various economic levers, as I've said, and while those, I will take on board the comments that have been made within this House about the importance of doing that. We recognise that it wasn't just a case of the strikes taking place on Saturday morning, that we do need to follow this up with this international action. We will look at the economic levers we can take place. I've already discussed, as I've referenced, the Foreign Affairs Council in Europe has already been looking at the willingness to take further action. I've discussed that with a number of European Union leaders as well.
Richard Graham.
Speaker, the Prime Minister today has made a compelling case for limited military action against the use of chemical warfare in Syria. But the wider diplomatic and political initiatives to bring about the end of these ghastly conflicts in Syria and achieve a lasting peaceful solution seem no closer to resolution today than they were 5 years ago. What does my right honourable friend believe is possible to try and get all the parties involved refocused on achieving that desperately difficult goal?
I say to my honourable friend, and he's right, I mean, obviously it has been difficult over the years that this conflict has taken place to bring the parties around the table. I think it's important not only that the opposition parties in Syria are willing to come around the table, which they are, but the regime is, and Russia needs to play its part in ensuring that the regime is willing to come forward and to sit down and discuss the future of Syria.
Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know that the Syrian civil war will only end through diplomatic means, which is why this evening's Stop the War demonstration should be taking place outside the Russian embassy and not outside this Parliament. The truth is that had the UN Security Council fulfilled its obligations, then we wouldn't be facing the scenario the Prime Minister described this afternoon. But can I ask her, with the same degree of urgency and with the same scale of response that she's provided in the last week, look again at the humanitarian crisis? Because this country has taken only 11,000 refugees. Look at Syria's neighbours, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, all of whom are bearing the brunt of that humanitarian crisis. We have a responsibility to protect Syrian civilians, whether in Syria, in surrounding countries, or those making their way to this country, and I don't think we've stepped up to the mark, not nearly enough.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, as I've said before, we are providing, of course, support within the region to those refugees, and we have done so on the basis that we believe it is important. We want to see a resolution to the Syrian conflict such that people will be able to return home in the future, and that support in region is more likely to enable that to happen. But he's also he's absolutely right when he says that Russia must bear its responsibility for what is happening in Syria and for the continuation of this conflict.
Order. I'm keen to accommodate the level of interest in the House. This is an extremely important occasion, and in my experience, the Prime Minister never complains about having to answer questions, or at least she never does to me anyway, and I'm very grateful for that, and I appreciate that. But it would be helpful if colleagues would be succinct, and I know that that quality will be magnificently exhibited now by Anna Soubry.
Don't hold your breath, Mr. Speaker. Could I just say that the Prime Minister is absolutely right in ordering the airstrikes this weekend? Would she agree with me that the Leader of the Opposition, however, was completely wrong? Wrong in his failure to blame Assad for the chemical attacks on his own people, and wrong when he said that this country hasn't been playing its part in assisting refugees. We are the second biggest donor in the world. Broxtow's taken 4, soon to be 5 families, Mr. Speaker, and we are very proud of that. For a borough of our size, that is a serious achievement, and we hope to take more. Would my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree it is now imperative that countries across the world play their part in the humanitarian relief for those who've had to flee from Assad's regime?
Look, I can deal with most things, but it's quite difficult dealing with lawyers. The Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend asked about other countries playing their part in the humanitarian support and support for refugees. She's absolutely right, and that's why I hope countries will step up at the conference that is due to take place in Brussels towards the end of this month, so that we can ensure that support is available.
Fiona Adesanya.
In the Prime Minister's statement, she said, "We are confident in our own assessment that the Syrian regime was highly likely responsible." My question to the Prime Minister is that surely the burden of proof should be beyond reasonable doubt as opposed to being highly likely. In addition to that, I would be interested to know who we are when Parliament was not consulted.
Well, I can say the government made its assessments. Those assessments were not just the view of the UK government. They were shared by our allies, and on that basis we acted.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Mr. Speaker, may I support my right honourable friend in her decisive action this weekend and say that were we waiting for war crimes prosecutions to take place, we would still be waiting for prosecutions dating to the events back in 2013 that she described. Whilst I urge her to collect evidence relating to war crimes, can I also urge her, if the position arises again, that she acts as she did this weekend?
Can I say to my honourable friend that we will always act in the national interest, and there should be no doubt about our resolve on this issue of ensuring that we return to the international norm of the prohibition on the use of chemical weapons.
James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada to Prime Minister Abe in Japan, European leaders, leaders in Australia, leaders in New Zealand, the leaders of international bodies around the world stand shoulder to shoulder with her, France and the United States of America in taking this action. Will she assure me that she will not listen to the increasingly small and isolated number of voices who insist that the Russian regime has a veto on our international actions, and will she instead listen to those numerous voices around the world who support the action she took at the weekend?
I'm very happy to give my honourable friend that assurance.
Chris Bryant.
Inaction and indecision has its cost, and so far in Syria that has been met by the children of Syria, the parents who've lost their homes, the people who've lost their lives, and the families who've been displaced. So I say, yes, of course, the Prime Minister is right. When there is an emergency to take action, she has that prerogative right. but nearly always it will be better to come to the House of Commons first. In the end, the most pernicious role in Syria has been played by Russia. They have systematically refused to allow people to investigate where war crimes have been committed. They've advanced their own territorial ambitions, and we must make sure that they pay the price in the end. Is that not right?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. Nobody should be in any doubt about the role that Russia has played in relation to this issue, and Russia could play a role in ensuring that we can find a diplomatic and political solution to what is happening in Syria. They have been unwilling to do so, and they have supported a regime which has illegally used chemical weapons to kill and to injure its own civilians, including young children.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of the ghastly chemical attacks that my right honourable friend has announced this afternoon would be classed as war crimes. So she was absolutely right, in my view, to take the action she has. In contrast, what would have been the consequence for future tyrants if the Leader of the Opposition had failed to take military action?
I say to my honourable friend, I think the fact is that without action, then the message would have been given that it was OK to use chemical weapons, both by this regime but by any others who chose to do so. It's very important that we re-establish the fact that chemical weapons use is illegal and that the international community will not stand by and see these weapons being used.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems it's a week in which the government, first of all, has sought to leave the Commonwealth and nearly deported its citizens, in which it has sought to defend the international rules-based system by ignoring the United Nations and reclaim parliamentary sovereignty by not using it. Can the Prime Minister advise the House where does this fit in their plan for a global Britain?
Say to the honourable gentleman, he talks about we have not ignored the United Nations. We have tried to work through the United Nations, but Russia has vetoed action in the United Nations. And if what he is saying is that this country should effectively give Russia a veto over our foreign policy, then I have to say to him that I absolutely disagree. The United Kingdom government will determine the United Kingdom's foreign policy, nobody else.
Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Russia is waging a propaganda war. It's involved in the cover-up. It's reporting that the attack was staged, and it has, over many months, systematically and strategically used social media to undermine Western engagement and intervention in Syria. While it is right to hold the government to account, does my right honourable friend agree that the Leader of the Opposition is at risk of becoming a voice for our country's enemies?
Can I say to my honourable friend, that I think it is important that everybody across this House is in no doubt of the way in which Russia has supported the Syrian regime and the way in which Russia has acted, which means that it has been much harder to do what the Leader of the Opposition and others have looked for, which is to bring an end to the conflict in Syria. Russia is playing a negative role, they could play a positive role, and we should be in no doubt of the actions that Russia has taken and the role it's playing.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When David Cameron came to the House in 2011, following the start of our intervention in Libya, it was for a full debate on an emendable motion. He got that approval by 557 votes to 13. I offer no prizes for guessing who was in the 13, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister follow the precedent set by David Cameron and tomorrow allow the House a vote on an emendable motion and not just a general debate?
The right honourable gentleman quotes the former Prime Minister. Can I say the former Prime Minister had also said to the House of Commons in 2014, it's important to reserve the right that if there were a critical British national interest at stake, or there were the need to act to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, you could act immediately and explain to the House of Commons afterwards.
Mr. Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Prime Minister, I think she's absolutely right in the actions she took and the way she took them. And she was also right in her statement to continue to press for the re-establishment of the international investigative mechanism. But can I say to her, does she believe that mechanism will be thwarted and that ambition will be thwarted unless the Russians give up their veto of the Security Council and the OPCW allowed to continue their investigations unhindered in Syria?
I would like to see the OPCW able to continue their investigations unhindered, but as my honourable friend has put his finger on it, unless the Russians are willing, within the Security Council, to put aside the position they've taken previously and accept that it is important that we re-establish this international rules-based order, that we allow those investigations to take place and we hold the Syrian regime accountable for what they've been doing.
McFadden.
Hear, hear. This debate is heavily coloured by the vote that took place in this House in 2013 against the use of military action after the Syrian regime had used chemical weapons at that time. Can the Prime Minister tell the House how many times the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons against its own people since we took that vote and since Russia promised to oversee the elimination of the Syrian chemical weapons programme?
I made reference in my statement to a number of occasions on which the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons as evidence and as has been accepted by the United Nations. And this is exactly the problem. They said they would get rid of their chemical weapons. The Russians said they would guarantee that would happen. It did not happen. Chemical weapons have been used on a number of occasions since.
Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker, I support the decision the Prime Minister took both to authorise action that degraded chemical weapons capability but also sent a very clear message about its unacceptability. I listened carefully to the Leader of the Opposition, but having listened to him and looked at what he's done in this House when he's opposed military action, whether it was authorised by the UN and indeed when it was asked for by the government of Iraq to deal with Daesh, I know the Prime Minister took that decision with great care and attention. A Prime Minister must do, but a Prime Minister that's never willing to use military action isn't fit to hold that office.
There is no harder decision for a Prime Minister to take than to commit British armed forces to action. It is a grave responsibility, but sadly there are occasions where it is necessary to take that decision. And yes, be held accountable for it. But the idea that we would never commit our armed forces to action is completely unacceptable. We have to accept that there are occasions when it is right for our armed forces to be sent out there into action on our behalf, and that is what we have done.
McKinnell.
The international community has a responsibility to protect civilians caught up in conflict. So would the Prime Minister explain how she and the international community intend to hold Assad and his allies fully to account in the interest of preventing further atrocities?
The first step that we've taken to, in the interest of preventing further atrocities, is to take action to degrade the chemical weapons capability of the regime. We also want to follow this up with the diplomatic and political pressure on this issue of the use of chemical weapons, and we believe that it's not just about degrading the chemical weapons capability of the regime. I hope this has sent a message to others as well, that the international community is resolved in not being willing to see the use of chemical weapons normalised.
Vicky Ford.
Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has suggested Britain only acted because it was instructed to do so by the US. And I find that hugely disrespectful to the British government, to British armed forces and to our allies in France. Does the Prime Minister agree that it is vital that the government can take action rapidly when needed, and it is vital that we send a message to Putin and Assad that we are ready to use such powers?
Well said, Vicky.
Yes. Let nobody be in any doubt. We did not act under instruction from anybody. We acted in the national interest.
Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So far today, the Prime Minister has ducked out of questions about Saudi Arabia's involvement in the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, which is Yemen. She hasn't answered why she wouldn't wait until the outcome of the OPCW inspections, and she hasn't explained why a parliamentary recall would jeopardise the action that President Trump had already tweeted about. She hasn't answered about providing further humanitarian assistance for additional support for refugees, and yet she talks about parliamentary scrutiny. How is a statement after the event parliamentary scrutiny when she won't answer any hard questions?
That he talks about me not answering questions on refugees. I have done so on the OPCW. I have done so. I have answered many questions, and I have to say I will be answering many more on this particular issue.
And Dr. Andy Mirison.
The UK and the men and women of our armed forces should be enormously proud of being part of a triumvirate that over the weekend delivered necessary and proportionate and humane military effect, and the Prime Minister should be proud of her leadership. Yes. In addition to its disgracefully deployed veto on the UN Security Council, would the Prime Minister agree that Russia also has another veto, and that is the veto it's able to exercise by virtue of shifting its military assets around Syria?
Yes, my honourable friend is right that we should look very carefully at the role that Russia is playing in Syria, and Russia has the capability of acting in a different way, of ensuring that the parties can sit down together and can resolve this issue and find a political solution. They have not been willing to do so far, but we will make every effort to ensure that all the parties are willing to do that and are willing to ensure we can find that political solution.
Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the targeted buildings were not empty, what assessment does the Prime Minister have of the casualties?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that we have no evidence of casualties so far. If there are reports of casualties, those will be properly investigated. Of course, that is in sharp contrast to the action that is the approach that is taken by the Syrian regime and their Russian backers. The planning was done very carefully to ensure that we minimise the possibility of casualties.
Rebecca Powell.
My right honourable friend, put to bed the less than constructive comments we are getting from some members of the opposition that Friday's action was taken as a knee-jerk reaction to President Trump. And rather, can my right honourable friend give assurances that action was taken in the national interest to give a clear message that using chemical weapons anywhere, whether it be Syria or Salisbury, is simply unacceptable, and we cannot turn our backs on action like this?
Very happy to repeat to my honourable friend. This action was taken, we believed it was the right thing to do, it was in our national interest, it was not under the instruction of anybody else. We determined that it was right for the United Kingdom to be part of this action in order to degrade a chemical weapons capability that could have been used to inflict further humanitarian suffering.
Stephen Pound.
If not regime change, what is the end game?
We want to ensure, well, the step we want to be able to see is the parties coming together around the table to agree a political solution to the future of Syria. There is a key role. We have been pressing for that. We've been supporting the Geneva process. We continue to support Staffan de Mistura and the work that he is doing. It is up to not just the Syrian regime, but its backers to ensure that they are willing to see that discussion take place and a proper solution for Syria being resolved in the interest of all its people.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Speaker, leadership takes great courage, and my right honourable friend has shown it in spades, and I commend her, as do most in the House today. I'm sure she would agree with me that I'd be failing if I did not mention the money spent on our armed forces in difficult times such as this. And I ask her, please, to consider to spend more money on our defence so we are ready, God forbid, they are needed more in the future.
I recognise the interest my honourable friend has shown in this particular topic and the way in which he has championed the armed forces in relation to the financial settlements. I was able, prior to Easter, to announce some extra money which was being made available to the Ministry of Defence, and of course we do have the Modernising Defence Programme in hand, in which we are looking to ensure, he refers to our capabilities, we are looking to ensure that we have the capabilities necessary to deal with the variety of threats that we face. But the capabilities for our security will be of a variety of sorts, not all of which will lie within the Ministry of Defence.
Anna Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question and intervention from my right honourable friend from Wolverhampton South East, it was after this House voted against strikes in 2013 that the government and opposition accepted Russia's assurances that it would oversee the dismantling of Assad's chemical weapon capability. And yet, over the past 5 years, Russia have used its veto no fewer than 9 times at the Security Council. 5 of those vetoes were specifically on motions which could have hampered the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Does she, like I, believe that we were wrong to accept Russia's commitment? And can she tell this House about what her next steps are at the UN Security Council?
Can I say to the honourable lady, obviously I was one of those who voted in favour of action being taken when the vote was taken in this House in 2013. I think it was a guarantee from Russia was accepted, and it has been proved that that was wrong because they did not deliver on that, and the Syrian regime have not delivered on their commitment. And so that's right, it is important that we do take this issue of the use of chemical weapons into the United Nations. I spoke to the United Nations Secretary-General about further steps that can be taken over the weekend.
David Duquette.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend reassure the House that, contrary to claims over the weekend, there is no evidence that any British defence export products have ended up in the wrong hands in Syria?
I can certainly give my honourable friend that assurance.
Mary Cray.
Mr. Speaker, can I pay tribute to our Royal Air Force personnel, some of whom I had the privilege to meet on a NATO delegation to Qatar last month? Does she agree with me that international humanitarian law is clear? There is no time, no place, ever, where chemical weapons may be used, and enforcing that law, that taboo, is absolutely imperative, whether those weapons are used on the streets of Salisbury or the bunkers of Douma. And many on this side of the House support the action she took. We'd also support Labour's proud tradition of taking action to intervene in humanitarian protection conflicts, notably in Kosovo and Sierra Leone, and we will act to protect that tradition.
Can I thank the honourable lady for her comments? Can I say, first of all, she is absolutely right. We should be proud of our Air Force's personnel, as we should be proud of all of our armed forces and the work that they do for us and to keep us safe. But as she said, there is a proud tradition on the in the Labour Party of being willing to take action on these matters when it is necessary to do so, and she has reflected that proud tradition today.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the British military action in Syria over the weekend, what assessment has the government made of the asymmetrical threats faced by the United Kingdom, and what actions are being taken to combat those?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, there are a number of areas where we have been enhancing our ability to deal with potential threats that would hit us. I've referred earlier to the potential for cyber attacks, and we have enhanced our capability of dealing with that. And we, of course, continue to look to ensure that we have the right defences in place, whatever the potential threat.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I regret that there wasn't a parliamentary vote on this issue, but I wish to tell the Prime Minister and the House that she would have had my vote had I been asked to give it. And I think in the future that would be better for the country to be able to understand what is going on. I also rise to ask that everybody in this place tries to have better faith in each other in critiquing whether they think this is right or wrong, because this is not an opportunity for politics about the local elections. This is about children being gassed. And on both sides I have heard ridiculous politicking and bad faith. People need to have good faith in us, and it is not about our voices. It is about the Syrian people's voices. And so with that I ask, where are they in all of this? And what is the British government doing with its aid to try and build Syrian civic society?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for the comments that she's made, and I think she's right. On issues like this, it is important that across the House we deal with these issues with the solemnity which they require, because, as she says, at the end of the day, this is about the impact that it's had on children and men and women in Syria. And we will continue to work. We work with Syrian refugees in the region. Of course, we want to ensure that at the time when it is possible for them to return to Syria, they are able to build that stronger Syria, a more stable and secure Syria for the future.
Kemi Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister believe that when urgent targeted action is required, waiting for a parliamentary vote could not just put our armed forces in harm's way, but also give those stockpiling chemical weapons enough time to conceal them?
My honourable friend is right that in considering action of this sort, it is imperative that, as one of the elements that we consider, is the operational security of our armed forces. Another is the timeliness to ensure that we can have the impact that we wish to have.
Mr. Speaker, can I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the professionalism of the Royal Air Force in the task that they carried out this week, and also agree with her that taking a decision for military action is the most difficult one a Prime Minister or a parliamentarian can take. But on the issue, does she understand the frustration of elected members of this House of Commons on being sidelined on the decision last week, when we had to rely on the Twitter account of the US President for information and also the mainstream news? We did. We should have been consulted, because that Twitter account was giving away all Americans' actions for the future, and that we had to find out in that way. We should have been called back to this House of Commons to offer our support to the RAF and to others in this country.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for the support that he has given to the Royal Air Force. And can I simply say to him, as I've said to others in the past, this is not a question of whether on every occasion one particular approach is taken or another. What it is about is ensuring that action can be taken in the way that is going to ensure that it meets the needs. And this was limited, targeted action taken on a legal basis that had been accepted by a number of governments previously.
Maggie Throop.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for so clearly laying out the humanitarian grounds on which she made the very difficult decision to take action last Friday. However, what more humanitarian aid could be provided if only Assad and Putin would allow access to Syria?
Well, friends raised a very important point. If we could have that humanitarian access, then so many more people in Syria could be supported, could be provided with the medical support that they need, the medical help that they need, with the food and water and other things for life that they need. Sadly, it is the Syrian regime and its Russian backers that are preventing that.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of thousands of people lie dead. 1.5 million people are injured, and millions are displaced by the use of chemical and conventional weapons. Should this House not have been recalled last week to discuss how de-escalation of this crisis is brought about, which is absolutely vital to see the long-term security within the region?
To the honourable lady, and when we took this action, it was taken, as I say, it was limited, it was targeted, it was taken with a view to minimising the possibility of civilian casualties and also minimising the risk of escalation of the conflict.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Speaker, Russia and Syria have lied and lied again about the use of these vile weapons for the mass murder of civilians in Syria. But this isn't just a distant conflict. We've also seen these vile weapons used in Salisbury and would have resulted in the deaths of 3 people were it not for the intervention of intensive care and expert medical help that we have a resource to here. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's time for people to stop acting as the useful idiots of the Russian regime by appearing on programmes such as Russia Today and to look at the facts and bear their own responsibility?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. I think nobody should be in any doubt of the actions of Russia, and nobody should be supporting that. We should all be recognising the role that Russia has played in backing the Syrian regime, in failing to guarantee that they were getting rid of the dismantling all their chemical weapons, and continues to play in vetoing action in the UN Security Council, and in not encouraging the Syrian regime to come to a resolution of this conflict.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK should be proud of the role that it has played in advancing the principle of intervention to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. And it would be shameful if that were abandoned now by people who, in fact, would not countenance intervention under any circumstances. But there is surely another need for that humanitarian intervention now in Syria, and that is for the military to guarantee the safety of aid convoys getting into besieged areas. It meets the government's test. Will she consider it?
I say to the honourable gentleman that we have, over the time of this conflict, looked on a number of occasions at how we can ensure humanitarian access is available to those people who need it in Syria. And I think the overriding consideration that we must have is ensuring that whatever decisions are taken, whatever access is given, that is genuinely going to work and is genuinely going to provide that. Unfortunately, of course, the Syrian regime and its backers have been preventing that humanitarian access so far, but we will continue to press for it.
Mr. Marcus Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for her leadership on this very difficult issue. The use of chemical weapons, whether they are in Syria or on the streets of Salisbury, are completely unacceptable. Can my right honourable friend confirm to the House that she will stay absolutely resolute and continue to advocate against the use of chemical weapons, and not listen to some of those people in this House who seem quite happy to put the interests of countries like Russia before the interests of our great country?
Yes, I can absolutely assure my honourable friend that we will continue to press this case to ensure that we can restore that international norm of prohibition on the use of chemical weapons.
Patricia Gibson.
Will the Prime Minister set out what her government is actively doing to prevent the further escalation of the conflict in Syria, given that she has apparently left open the possibility of more strikes should another chemical attack take place? And does she think there is sufficient public support for more strikes?
As I've said, we took limited and targeted action to degrade the chemical weapons capability, to deter the willingness of the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons, and to give a clear message to others on the use of chemical weapons. But we are resolved, and nobody should doubt our resolve, to ensure that we can restore the position where nobody believes that the use of chemical weapons is normalised.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When a member of the United Nations Permanent Council's representatives blatantly lie and suggest that Britain somehow staged the appalling atrocities which we have all witnessed, can she confirm at the dispatch box that she had no other choice but indeed to fulfil the actions that she did in order to help the Syrian people?
My honourable friend was right. These actions were taken in order to alleviate future humanitarian suffering by the Syrian people. I continue to believe, as I think is clear from so many members of this House, that that was the right action to take.
Debbie Abrahams.
Following the UK's military intervention in Kosovo in 1999 on humanitarian grounds, Russia invaded Georgia using the same legal justification. So what has the assessment been of the misuse of humanitarian reasons for military intervention that may be used by other states in the long term?
To the honourable lady, we are responsible for the actions that we take. We have used, as she has said, and I said in my statement, this legal basis on a number of occasions now. I think it was absolutely right to use it on this occasion.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2013, I voted against action in Syria. I did so on the basis of no more information than I had seen on the 6 o'clock news. That is why we have an executive, and that is an executive which is drawn from and accountable to Parliament. And that is why the Prime Minister's action was 100% correct in this case. And I have weighed on my conscience forevermore that vote we took in 2013 and whether we were responsible for some of these attacks. This afternoon, people have got to their feet in this chamber and accused the Prime Minister of operating on the basis of instructions from Washington. Will the Prime Minister go further and say that not only are those suggestions wrong, they are a smear, they are disgusting, and they are insulting to our troops?
Prime Minister.
Absolutely agree with my honourable friend. I think that accusation is indeed insulting. It is certainly not true. It's insulting to the government, and it is insulting, to, as he says, to our troops who so professionally and bravely carry out the action we do.
Peter Kyle.
The Prime Minister acted entirely appropriately in the way that she did, because if these chemical weapons became normalised, not only would they be used against civilians going forward, but the time would surely come where our own service men and women would go into action for our country and they would be used against them too, and that would be unforgivable. But military action is not a replacement for diplomacy. Does she accept that we need a global response on the scale of the Gleneagles Summit, where we focus the world's attention onto international development, in order to tackle Syria and put strategy behind it once and for all?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for the point that he's made, that if chemical weapons were allowed to continue to be used, they would be used by all by other people, not just against civilians, but potentially against service personnel as well. And it is right that we do want to ensure that there is a major effort on the diplomatic side to find a resolution to the situation in Syria. That's why we continue to back the Geneva process and will work to ensure that that is reignited.
Steve Double.
Speaker, can I congratulate the Prime Minister for the clear and calm but courageous and decisive leadership that she has shown over the last week. But as a humble backbencher, can I also thank her for not putting the responsibility on me for making this decision without having the full information and intelligence that was available to her? And does she share my view that whilst we need to learn the lessons of the past, it is time for this House and indeed for our country to get over the mistakes of the past and to stand proud on the international stage again?
Well, I think, and if I may just say to my honourable friend, I think the point he makes is right, which is that it is the situation that the government will have information available to it, which it is not possible to make available to the House on all occasions. And it is important to be able to operate in a timely fashion to protect the safety and security of our armed forces when that's being done on a legal basis that is accepted.
Thelma Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The children escaping war and terrible atrocities in Syria have been refused asylum and protection by this government in the past. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. Britain is better than this, and this military action has not been taken in my name. So could I ask the Prime Minister, does bombing a country, then refusing to give asylum to children seeking refuge, reflect this government's idea of British values?
Can I say to the honourable lady, we have been granting asylum to children and to adults from Syria. We have a number of schemes on which we do that, but we have also been supporting and maintaining and providing food and medical assistance and water to hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees in the region. This House, and the honourable lady included, should be proud of the fact that we are the second largest humanitarian bilateral donor.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, can I commend the Prime Minister for her leadership in the face of the awful atrocities that we've seen in Syria and the use of these chemical weapons, and to try and prevent them for the future. Decision to use military force is clearly a very serious decision, and serious decisions need to be made by those in possession of all the intelligence, all of the advice and full knowledge of our military capabilities. Can my right honourable friend tell the House whether making such information available to Parliament
in advance of such military action could risk the lives of our intelligence personnel, our military personnel and the effectiveness of the operation itself.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and this is one of the factors that a government has to bear in mind in weighing these decisions. The extent to which information can be made available, and as I've said, not all of it can, and also the impact that making information available in advance of a decision to act could have on the on the security of our armed forces personnel and on the capability and the whether or not the action, when it is taken, is successful. She is absolutely right on that.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister referred to casualties with foam in their mouths, burning eyes and respiratory distress, and an associated chlorine-like odour. These symptoms are more in keeping with Assad's repeated use over the last 5 years of the respiratory corrosive chlorine gas, rather than the paralytic neurotoxin sarin, which seemed to be the main target of the military action. As chlorine is commonly available, how, without an overarching plan to end the war, does the Prime Minister hope to limit the production and dropping of chlorine gas by the regime on their own civilians?
Yes. Well, this is about chemical weapons and about taking action against chemical weapons. And the Honourable Lady is absolutely right that, of course, some of that action will have been in relation to capacity and capability of sarin, which, of course, has been used by the Assad regime. So the willingness for them to use a variety of types of chemical weapon is what underpins this, and our need to act to degrade that capability and deter their willingness to use them in future.
Hugh Merriman.
Mr. Speaker, 11 million Syrians have either been displaced or killed since this action by Assad's government was taken. Like many honourable members across this chamber, I met with many of those refugees in the camps that British aid is supporting. Those people want to go home. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that we have two choices? We can either send a message that we will not stand up for chemical warfare which kills and maims, or we can close our eyes, pretend this is not happening, talk about diplomatic solutions that can't be delivered, and effectively condemn more innocent people to their deaths.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. It is imperative that we act and give a very clear message about the use of chemical weapons. This is about preventing humanitarian suffering in future. To stand by would have given the message that actually these weapons could be used with impunity, and we cannot accept that.
Anna McMorrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent is from Eastern Ghouta and came to me inconsolable, in floods of tears, to plead for a ceasefire to help protect her family who are still in the area. Can I ask the Prime Minister what comes after military action and what long-term strategy is in place to prevent this humanitarian crisis and more civilian casualties, to assist my constituents' family and everyone else suffering?
Yes. Can I say to the Honourable Lady that sometimes what appear to be simple solutions actually don't always operate on the ground and act on the ground in relation to matters such as ceasefire. We have been encouraging ceasefires, we have been encouraging humanitarian access, and she asks about the longer-term solution. As I've said, this isn't just a question for the United Kingdom, it is a question for us and our international allies to work with, and we continue to work and want to see the Geneva process, the United Nations process under Staffan de Mistura once again able to come together to find that long-term solution. But it is also necessary for the Syrian regime and its backers to be willing to see a political solution in Syria and to be willing to come around the table and to provide that peace and stability for people in that country.
Neil O'Brien.
Speaker, in recent weeks we've heard claims from the Russian government that the British government was behind the nerve gas attack in Salisbury. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this is typical of Russian propaganda, that it shows that Vladimir Putin is not serious about stopping the use of chemical weapons, and that he must not be given a veto over this country's foreign policy?
Yes. I absolutely agree with my honourable friend.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker. I firstly want to pay tribute to our armed forces who serve so bravely and professionally whenever they are called upon. My husband served in the armed forces, and absolutely nothing would have stopped me returning early from recess last week to Parliament to deliberate such grave matters. Not specifics that put service personnel at risk, but the premise of action as has been the parliamentary precedent. We cannot set the opposite precedent going forward, and will the Prime Minister reassure the House that future matters will be debated and agreed by Parliament?
To the Honourable Lady, I've already made reference to the written ministerial statement that was put out in 2016, which set out the position, and I stand by that, and can I suggest to the Honourable Lady she looks at that, but can I thank her for the comments she's made about the armed forces. I think their professionalism and bravery is beyond doubt.
Andrew Bridgen.
Right honourable friend agree with me that unfortunately it's clear that some of those who claim to support the introduction of a war powers bill actually wish to see the introduction of a no war powers bill, the main beneficiary of which will be countries and groups around the world whose interests and values are diametrically opposed to ours, and ultimately it will make the world a far more dangerous place.
Can I say to my honourable friend that I sympathise with the comments that he's made. In fact, I believe that even when the United Nations supported action in Syria against Daesh, the Leader of the Opposition says he wants to see United Nations support for action. Even when they did support that action, the Leader of the Opposition opposed it.
Richard Burden.
Recognising that there can be circumstances which preclude a government from consulting Parliament before taking military action, would the Prime Minister agree with me that the default position, as per convention, is that Parliament should be consulted in advance, not on operational details, but on the strategy within which those operational details fit? And would she also take it from me that nothing she said so far convinces me that on this occasion there was not the time and the opportunity to consult this House? In relation to the future strategy going forward, though, as the action was taken to limit further humanitarian catastrophe, what action she believes Britain should take, and how will it garner international support to prevent the loss of civilian life in Idlib on the scale that it was in Aleppo and in eastern Ghouta?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, as I have to others, I suggest he looks at the position as set out in the written ministerial statement that was published in 2016 about government action versus parliamentary debate on these matters. And can I also say to him that we have set out very clearly that we will be working with international partners in a number of ways, with France in the international partnership on the ensuring that chemical weapons cannot be used with impunity, which has now been established, and through the United Nations and in other fora too.
Will Quince.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for her statement, which included a timely reminder of the United Kingdom being the second largest donor in terms of bilateral aid to the region. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that not only does this send a very clear message to despots that might consider using chemical weapons in the future, but also by taking out those chemical weapons facilities, we will make sure that more vulnerable, innocent citizens in Syria are protected?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. By degrading the chemical weapons capability, we will be ensuring that we are alleviating further humanitarian suffering.
Newlands.
The situation in Syria is clearly a very grave and complex one which we cannot ignore. But for the government to continue its systematic contempt of Parliament with a retrospective statement is to be regretted. To avoid this in future, we should commit to heeding the calls of my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow South, for a War Powers Act which would allow this House to debate the exact parameters in which a Prime Minister can order military action without prior parliamentary approval, which would be useful to all sides of the House.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that this is not about not saying that Parliament can never have the opportunity to debate these matters. What it is about saying that there was limited and targeted action taken on a legal basis that had been accepted by governments of all types over a number of years, and doing so in a timely manner, allowing for proper planning, but also ensuring that we were able to have an impact and be effective in our action.
I hope the right honourable lady gentleman for Rushcliffe is comfortable. I'm quite bothered that he's not. Well, characteristically solicitous of the right honourable and lady gentleman, we would expect nothing less of him. Mr. Kevin Hollinrake.
Without the support of the Kremlin, it is unlikely that Assad would have been in the position to carry out this and many other atrocities on his own people. But according to a leaked EU report last week, Russia is using its gas supplies to the EU to further its foreign policy ambitions. Does the Prime Minister agree that every nation should seek to reduce their reliance on Russian oil and gas supplies?
Well, I think it is right that everybody should think very carefully about the role that Russia is currently playing in a number of ways, not just in Syria, but also in terms of the activities it is undertaking across Europe and elsewhere, destabilising activities, propaganda, cyber attacks, and the like.
Steve McCabe.
Mr. Speaker, I support the Prime Minister's action. I'm sure the decision weighs heavily on her shoulders. Does she accept that her government still has a job to do to convince millions of people in this country that it can show the same resolve and commitment to the search for an end to this conflict as she's been able to show over the way she's dealt with this matter?
What I say to the honourable gentleman is he's absolutely right that, of course, 7 more years on, we haven't been able to find a resolution to this conflict. We retain our determination to do so, but it isn't just about the United Kingdom's determination, it's about the determination of a whole variety of parties, including the Syrian regime and its backers.
Shelbrooke.
Mr. Speaker, I totally and utterly support my right honourable friend's actions. I think it's right that she took the decision she took because to capitulate allows chemical weapons to be used. And the idea that we must come to Parliament and ask first of all, especially from the Leader of the Opposition, who once said that the Falklands conflict was a Tory plot to enrich our business friends, is simply ridiculous. But does my right honourable friend agree that to not take action, like in 2013, there is a clear chronological link to the actions that President Putin then took in Crimea, in East Ukraine, which has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of more people? Inaction has its consequences.
Well, friend is right that inaction has its consequences. If people take a particular action, such as the use of chemical weapons, and see that there is no reaction, that there is no response to that, then they assume that it is possible to carry on using those chemical weapons. And I think it's important that we, as an international community, have said that we do want to restore the international norm against the use of chemical weapons, and that we've acted in this way to give that very clear message about degrading a capability in order to alleviate future humanitarian suffering.
The butcher Assad and his Russian backers hold the lives of the Syrian people cheap, not just evidenced by the use of chemical weapons, but by other weapons of war, of siege and the use of barrel bombs. Does she agree with me that whatever happened this weekend, the hideous Syrian civil war is not mission accomplished? And does she agree that we need to do more and urgently to raise the costs of those Syrian lives by taking far tougher action in respect of sanctions and restrictions on the activities of Russian state banks?
Can I say to the honourable lady, she's absolutely right that we need to ensure that we are putting every effort into finding ways to make sure that the parties do come round the table, that we do see that political solution in Syria. That is the way to ensure the security and stability of a country such that people can return and get on with their lives in peace.
One of the darkest stains on the international community's conscience was the inaction by the EU, by the United Nations, in preventing the massacre of Muslim men in Srebrenica. International humanitarian military action was right then, it was right in Bosnia, it is right now to prevent the massacre of innocent people in Syria. We have a moral duty to act.
The Prime Minister on BNP.
Is it going to be delayed?
Naz Shah.
I will not be congratulating the Prime Minister on the action taken this weekend. And the reason I say that, Mr. Speaker, only one day before the airstrikes on Homs and Damascus, US Defence Secretary James Mattis told Congress that the US did not have any hard evidence concerning the chemical weapons attacks, just social media indicators. Can the Prime Minister be clear, did more evidence emerge in the space of about 24 hours, or did she take her action on the basis of social media indicators?
Prime Minister.
I suggest that the honourable lady looks at my statement where I set out what led to our assessment in relation to the Syrian regime's action.
Nigel Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I saw the sickening photographs of suffering children poisoned by their own regime, I'm under no doubt whatsoever that the Prime Minister took the right action that she did. And does she not believe that that is one of the reasons why so many global leaders of different political persuasions have backed the humanitarian action that she took?
Prime Minister.
My right friend is absolutely right. We have had support from around the world, from Europe but from elsewhere as well, as he says, from people from all political persuasion who saw the humanitarian suffering and the need to act to alleviate that and stop that in future.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on her courageous decision? Well done. Last weekend, sources of chemical substances have been destroyed. Prime Minister, should another chemical attack take place, can this House be reassured that the apparatus of war, helicopters and aeroplanes, will next time be destroyed?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that obviously when we took this action we looked very carefully at targeting it to have what we believed was the necessary impact on the capability of the Syrian regime in relation to chemical weapons. It was a limited attack, I hope, and the intent of that was to degrade capability and to deter future use.
Victoria Prentice.
Mr. Speaker, in my previous role, I was security cleared and briefed to the highest level. As an MP, I am acutely conscious that I am not so well informed. Can the Prime Minister assure me that while it is right that she comes to this House to explain to us and also to listen to sensible voices from across this chamber, she will in future take action where it is necessary in emergency to protect humanity?
Well, my honourable friend, I think it's absolutely right that the government must have that ability to be able to act in an emergency where it is necessary to do so in order to alleviate humanitarian suffering, and as has been set out in the written ministerial statement in 2016.
Tracy Brabin.
Speaker, I'm sure that both sides of the House would like to congratulate the armed forces and their forensic and brilliant intelligence gathering on the location of these chemical weapons dumps. But can the Prime Minister now give us an assessment of Assad's remaining stockpile and capabilities after this strike? All the families in Syria will not be able to sleep easily in their beds, knowing that they still could die choking at night with their children in their arms.
This action was taken, it was targeted very carefully on chemical weapons capabilities. It was to degrade those capabilities, but it was also to deter the willingness of the regime to use those chemical weapons and to give a message to others about the resolve of the international community to ensure that we return to the situation where it is accepted that the use of chemical weapons is prohibited.
Simon Clarke.
Can I say that, in contrast to the lady for Bradford West, taking action to prevent the gassing of men, women and children will always be in my name. Does the way in which the Russians and the Syrians are now attempting to cover up their crimes in Syria not speak volumes to what has occurred and to the willful naivety of those who attempt to deny it?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. As I've set out, there are attempts being made to ensure that it is not possible to take that evidence on the ground about what has happened, and I think that speaks volumes about what has been done by the Syrian regime and the position taken by Russia.
Joe Platt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our response to the atrocity of a chemical weapons attack must be measured, and in the interest of the Syrian people, not just to reassure ourselves that we have taken action. With this in mind, this year the UN has only received 5% of the $3.5 billion that they need to assist the humanitarian needs of the Syrian people. So will the Prime Minister now increase the aid we send to help alleviate the suffering on the ground?
We are the second biggest bilateral donor in relation to humanitarian aid for the people in Syria, for the refugees of Syria, and we will be working with others at the conference that is taking place in Brussels towards the end of this month to ensure that people do in fact step up and provide the support that is needed.
Andrew Bowie.
Mr. Speaker, permanent membership of the Security Council is a privilege, but one that comes with huge responsibilities. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that in acting as they have done over this whole issue, in blocking at every stage a peaceful diplomatic solution, in defending at every stage the actions of Bashar al-Assad, the Russian Federation is not only shirking those responsibilities, but is complicit in the continued horrendous suffering of the Syrian people?
Prime Minister. My honourable friend is absolutely right. Russia has the ability within the Security Council, but also in its relationship with the Syrian regime, to stop the use of chemical weapons, and it has not done so.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a matter of concern across the country, and I want to thank my constituents who have written to me on this issue and reflect the very real and urgent concern that we will not see an end to the Syrian conflict without a diplomatic and political solution for the long term. I am concerned that this does not seem to happen with the same urgency as military action in a humanitarian emergency. So could the Prime Minister confirm that there will be a redoubling of diplomatic efforts and other non-military muscle, that any further military action will be subject to a debate and vote of this House, and that there has been no discussion of any extension of the role of our armed forces as a result of this decision that has not yet been brought to this House?
Can I say to the honourable lady that I recognise, as I have said in answer to a number of questions, that in relation to the wider Syrian conflict, we need to ensure that we are pressing ahead with every effort possible to bring that conflict to an end. But it is not just about the position that the United Kingdom has taken. There are other parties that need to be willing to come to the table and to develop that political solution for Syria for the future, not least the Syrian regime and its backers.
Sir Gareth Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister agree with me that it is frankly astonishing that over the past week the Leader of the Opposition has spent more time and effort attacking us than attacking President Assad? And will she also agree with me that therefore it's hardly surprising that some people question whose side he is on, theirs or ours?
Order. Can I just very gently say to the honourable gentleman, that was of itself not disorderly. It was not disorderly. If it was, I would have intervened straight away. But I do just want to say to the House this. Erskine May underscores the importance of moderation and good humour in the use of parliamentary language. And very politely I say, it's all very well for the House when someone says we should respect each other's motives to nod approvingly, and effectively either to say or to imply hear, hear, and then some minutes later for someone effectively to attack someone else's motives. If I may say so to the honourable gentleman, it's a technique to be used, if at all, very sparingly. We're democrats in this place, and we attack each other's political positions, but we should not impugn each other's integrity. No response is required from the honourable gentleman. I've said what the position is, and I would just suggest that we leave it there. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to my honourable friend that I'm sure, like me, he welcomes the many statements of support that have come from the Labour benches as well as from our own benches, and indeed the recognition from many in the Labour Party that it is a party that has a long and fine and proud tradition of being willing to take action in our national interest, but also to ensure that it is alleviating humanitarian suffering in the world.
Emma Hardy.
Many of my constituents in Hull, West and Hesel have contacted me with their fears surrounding potential escalation of conflict with Russia and the fact that we might be sleepwalking towards this. And they're also concerned that their voices were not heard before the Prime Minister launched this attack, because as their MP, I was unable to debate this issue. Please can the Prime Minister reassure this House that the government has a plan for de-escalation of this conflict now that airstrikes have taken place, and that her decision to take action without a parliamentary vote has not set a precedent for the future?
Minister.
I say to the honourable lady that when the decision to act was taken, when the planning was put into place, we were very careful. One of the issues that we were looked at very carefully was ensuring that we didn't reduce the risk of escalation, and the way in which the attacks were strikes were undertaken, and the action that we took was taken not only in a way to minimise civilian casualties, but also to minimise the risk of escalation.
Ah, yes, young Hoare. Mr. Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend share my hope that the events of Saturday and subsequently have sent a very clear message to Mr. Putin and indeed to President Assad that the so-called protective arm which Putin believes he has put around the shoulders of Assad and Syria, effectively making them inviolate and untouchable, isn't true. And when small children gurgle their last soaked in chlorine, and when our values and international law are undermined by the Putin-Assad axis, we will not stand by, we will always be active.
Prime Minister.
I agree with my honourable friend. I think it's important that we have sent a very clear message to the Syrian regime and to Russia and the Syrian regime's backers that we will not stand by when we see these chemical weapons being used. And we have taken action, and we will now follow that up with diplomatic and political action. But we're very clear about our resolve to ensure that we return to the international norm of the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons.
Clive Efford.
Mr. Speaker, it adds nothing to our debates if people suggest in this House that people on this side or any side of this chamber are not determined to see the chemical weapons eradicated. They may will different means, but everyone is equally determined. With that in mind, I would like to say that I believe that Bashar al-Assad should be pursued for all his days until he's arraigned before a court to answer for the crime of using chemical weapons on his people. But having said that, Prime Minister, when she comes to this House to speak to members of Parliament and answer questions, she's speaking to the people of this country, and she missed an opportunity to do that last week. 9 days elapsed before the airstrikes. Can I say to her that in these circumstances, again in the future, that she must come to this House and account for what she's intending to do?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that a number of actions were taken last week. The attempt was made within the United Nations Security Council, which was thwarted, to get the investigation, which was thwarted by Russia. I gave a number of interviews indicating that we were considering what action was necessary, but we needed to make an assessment of what had happened on the ground. So there were elements to the timeliness, assessment of what was happening on the ground, proper planning, but also timeliness to ensure that the action was effective.
Mr. David Morris.
Mr. Speaker, in September 2013, the Chemical Weapons Council secured an agreement with Syria, with Russia and the United States to dispose of weapons starting from the middle of 2014. We are now 2018, we've seen atrocities committed time and time again, and I want to ask the Prime Minister if she agrees with me that the judgment of the Leader of the Opposition is flawed, because it is illegal that we took that decision and we did carry it out in a legal basis.
Can I say to my honourable friend that I reiterated the legal basis in the statement that I made this afternoon. It is a legal basis that has been used by governments of all colours to support action when that action has been considered necessary.
Mr. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. She's prayed in aid the statement in 2016 by the former Defence Secretary, and I have read it very carefully. And the problem is that it re-emphasises the government's support for the Convention, and it also mentions the actions, similar sorts of airstrike actions that were taken in 2013, 2014 and 2015, that were not materially different to the action that was taken just this weekend. So isn't it the case that she could have and she should have used the Convention and come before the House before taking that action?
I repeat what I said previously. One of the elements of that written ministerial statement says, in observing the Convention, we must ensure that the ability of our armed forces to act quickly and decisively and to maintain the security of their operations is not compromised.
James Morris.
The Prime Minister was absolutely right to take the action that she did with her allies. It's the sort of action that should have been taken 5 years ago when this House, in a rather disastrous decision, decided not to take action against the Assad regime. So would the Prime Minister agree with me that not acting now would be a complete abrogation of our moral responsibility as a nation and as a member of the international community?
Prime Minister.
I agree. I think failure to act would have sent a message that chemical weapons could be used with impunity. We must not allow that message to go. We must show that the international community is resolved to ensure that chemical weapons are not used.
Toby Perkins.
Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty's Armed Forces enjoy the respect and admiration of people right across this House. So the Prime Minister's wrong to suggest that critics of her are somehow insulting her armed forces. We are all very proud of them, regardless of the decisions that she takes. In terms of the legal basis for this decision, which is alleviating humanitarian suffering, the vast majority of Syrians murdered by Assad have been killed with conventional weapons. Is it only those who are killed via chemical weapons that she considers she will be alleviating the humanitarian suffering for? Or does she consider there's a legal basis to alleviate the humanitarian suffering of those killed by conventional weapons?
Well, in relation to the wider conflict that has taken place in Syria, obviously the resolution of that it needs to come through a political solution which ensures the security and stability of and peace of Syria for the future, and that's where we will put our diplomatic and political efforts as we have continued to do so in the past.
Mary Robinson.
Mr. Speaker. There should be no acceptance of and no place in this world for the use of chemical weapons. However, it does seem that there has been a worrying increase in the tolerance towards their use. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that it is vital and so important that we send a clear and collective message that the use of chemical weapons will not be tolerated?
Yes, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. That's a very important message for us to send. I believe that's a message our action with the US and France has sent, and I believe it's an important message for this House to send.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Given what the Prime Minister has said about the careful targeting of the strikes, can she tell us what sites involved in the manufacturing and stockpiling of chemical weapons had to be ruled out from the scope of the strikes because of their location and proximity to civilians, what the risk of those sites continues to be, and what the anticipated consequences of any future attack on them might be?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that we looked obviously at where we felt it was possible to have a clear impact and degrading the chemical weapons capability of the Syrian regime, and that is what we did.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the Russian veto on the Security Council, not just of investigations, but actually of referring this matter to the International Criminal Court in Syria more generally, there's clearly only the use of force left to deter chemical weapons usage. What message does the Prime Minister think despots would take around the world if, as a nation, we just sat there and wrung our hands and did absolutely nothing?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend, I fear that the message they would have taken is that they could use chemical weapons with impunity, and that is not an acceptable message. We must ensure the use of these weapons is stopped.
Neil Gray.
Mr. Speaker, with two brothers having served past and present as officers of the British Army, of course, commend the bravery of our armed forces personnel, and no evidence chemical attack can go by without consequences. But when our national security was not at immediate risk, when she had time to consult her cabinet, why didn't she recall Parliament so my constituents of Airdrie and Shotts could have had their say, as I'm convinced they would have, had it been a sitting week last week?
Can I say to the Minister that I have already set out the basis on which we took the decision, the need for timeliness, for an opportunity for proper planning, but also to ensure that we were able to act in a way that was going to be effective.
Ben Bradley.
Speaker, could the Prime Minister do me the service of responding to some concerns raised by my constituents over the weekend, drawing comparisons with conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and explain to them precisely what the UK action was, i.e. how many missiles has the UK launched in Syria this weekend, and also explain to them why that comparison is without foundation?
Well, yes, I'm happy to do that. I mean, it was 8 Storm Shadow missiles that were launched from our RAF jets. Of course, there were more missiles which were launched by the French and the Americans together. But what I can say to my honourable friend is that I think the key issue for his constituents is that this was a targeted and limited action that we were taken. It was a targeted and limited action taken in relation to the use of chemical weapons. There has been for nearly a century an acceptance in the international community that chemical weapons should not be used. We have seen the Assad regime using them on a number of occasions. It was important that we gave that very clear message that we will not accept their use and we will not stand by and see these weapons being used.
Yes. Mr. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As our defence spokesman on these benches, can I commend what the Prime Minister has said thus far, but when she is being asked why she has not built that cohesive agreement at the UN. Would it be useful to reflect that in 2013, when the UN Security Council did pass a resolution, Articles 1 and 21 specifically envisaged and outlined coercive action to adherence to the protocol?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for the information that he has given to the House on this particular matter and the support that he's shown for the action. Thank you.
Fiona Bruce.
I thank the Prime Minister for her statement today, which I fully support, and for the leadership, indeed statesmanship, which she has shown in the measured, appropriate and clearly reasoned action she has taken in this grave matter and the manner in which she has taken it. She's spoken today of the need for a wider diplomatic effort to strengthen the global understanding that chemical weapons should never be used. In these diplomatic efforts, indeed to ensure they are most effective, will she confirm that not only the UK as a country, but also she as Prime Minister personally will continue to take a similarly strong and engaged global lead?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I'm happy to give her that assurance, and I think that this government, that the United Kingdom has a role to play in ensuring that we continue to uphold the international rules-based order, actually in this, but also in a number of other areas too.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has been categoric in explaining that the need to take action was based on principle. Can I just simply ask, having not been here in April 2017, why was the same action not taken then?
Prime Minister.
Well, I assume that the honourable gentleman is referring to Khan Sheikhoun. The United States of America did take action in relation to Khan Sheikhoun. We supported that action that was taken. On this time, I think it was a wider action that was being undertaken in order to degrade the chemical weapons capability, and I think it was right that there was a wider international community that took part in it.
Alan Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2016, Britain hosted the London conference, bringing together international donors and humanitarian supporters to help civilians in Syria. Will my right honourable friend commit to showing British leadership in this area in the years ahead?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend, in fact, there is to be a Brussels conference later this month which builds on the work that was done at the London conference, and we will continue to put our efforts into ensuring that that humanitarian support is available.
Anna Turley.
Mr. Speaker, I understand fully the purpose of the action that's been taken this weekend, and that it was both targeted and limited in order to degrade chemical weapons and reinforce the international norm that we do not use chemical weapons. And I support the Prime Minister in the action that she's taken. But the vast majority of deaths in Syria of civilians are as a result of bombs, barrel bombs, torture and starvation and other means, not by chemical weapons. So if this is not about intervening in civil war or regime change, as the Prime Minister has said, what is the government's wider strategy to save Syrian lives? And if Assad is still in power in a year's time and killing and maiming with impunity, what does that mean for mission accomplished?
Can I say to the honourable lady that it is, of course, through the diplomatic and political process that we can bring the final resolution of the Syrian conflict can be brought about, and that's why we will continue to support the United Nations efforts on this and the Geneva process, but it needs all parties to be willing to accept the need of bringing a solution about and ensuring that we can see a peaceful Syria to which people can return who have been displaced, and that the Syrian people can live in peace and security for the future.
Mr. Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that the obvious and inevitable consequence of seeking prior parliamentary approval for airstrikes would have been to give the Syria regime the heads-up on our plans? A debate on what, where, how and when the attacks would take place, therefore giving the regime the opportunity to move the very weapons we were seeking to destroy.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend makes an important point. It is important to plan these to ensure that we were able to do it in a timely fashion to be as effective as effective in the strikes that we took. And from one or two of the questions that I've been asked this afternoon, it seems that there are some members of this House who don't realise the importance of keeping certain operational information not public, so in order to protect our servicemen and ensure we are effective.
That includes Caroline.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister has repeatedly said she wants to deter dictators who may be minded to use chemical weapons against their own people or against anyone else. Does she also agree that we need to deter dictators who commit other heinous war crimes against civilians, including the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia, who currently stand accused of around 150 separate war crimes against innocent civilians in the Yemen? Does she not see the slightest contradiction between the severe action that she's taken in Syria and her willingness to sell another £2 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia and to invite the Saudis to investigate themselves rather than submit them to an international court of inquiry?
I say to the honourable gentleman, what we are talking about in relation to what has happened in Syria is the use of chemical weapons that are prohibited. They are illegal. Yet we see a Syrian regime that has continued to use those chemical weapons over a number of years. I think it is important that the international community has come together and said that we will not accept this use of chemical weapons. We must return to a situation where people accept that the use of chemical weapons is prohibited. We have taken that position to alleviate the humanitarian suffering that comes from the use of chemical weapons, and we continue to support the work that will be necessary to ensure the continued prohibition of the use of those weapons.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister on her calm and well-calibrated response to this situation? Some members opposite have questioned the decision to proceed without a vote first. Does the Prime Minister agree that there are circumstances when we need to act without a prior vote if the speed of military or diplomatic movements on the ground makes it impossible, if the disclosure of intelligence to the House makes it impossible for the House to make a decision, or where it would give our adversaries a sense of the scope, scale and timing of what is going to happen? And if one or more of those conditions apply, it is neither reasonable nor necessary to seek the House's consent first.
Well, my honourable friend speaks appropriately about the need to ensure that when one is looking at taking action, that action can be effective and that nothing is done that reduces the effectiveness of that action, that the action is taken on the basis of intelligence. Not all intelligence is able to be made available to everybody, but also that we respect and recognise the need to maintain the security and safety of our armed forces personnel.
I gather them. Ian C. Lucas.
Mr Speaker, when last week did the Prime Minister decide not to recall Parliament, and did she discuss that with the Cabinet on Thursday?
Of course, we were looking at the timetable for the action that we were going to take. The Cabinet considered a number of matters when it met. It was fully informed on all aspects of this decision.
James Cartledge.
When this country was subject to a chemical attack just a month ago, we called on the support of our allies, and they supported us in strength and speed. They have now asked us for that same support. How credible would we look to the international community and to those same allies if we turned an ideological cold shoulder on them when an attack was taken on a much greater scale against the innocent civilian population of the people of Syria?
Prime Minister.
I agree with my honourable friend that I think it is right to remember that when we talk about the use of chemical weapons, of course they were used on scale, at scale in Syria, but of course we have seen one being used, a nerve agent being used on the streets of the United Kingdom. It is imperative that we give a message that these weapons cannot and must not be used.
Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A decision of this magnitude required a parliamentary debate and vote. Will the Prime Minister commit to respecting that convention in the future?
Prime Minister.
Once again refer the honourable gentleman to the position that has been taken in relation to that convention, which is to accept that there are circumstances in which it is necessary for government to be able to act without coming to Parliament first, but that when government does so act, it should come to Parliament at the earliest opportunity to explain that action.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The situation in Syria is deeply complex and full of uncertainties, with perhaps the only certainty the tens of thousands of innocent men, women and children who have been butchered and killed. Prime Minister, further bombs will result in further death. And I would say that we need to pursue diplomacy and the political solution. And in that regard, I would ask you, can you inform the House what actions you have recently taken to pursue all political channels?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that the strikes that took place were about degrading the chemical weapons capability such that we can alleviate and prevent further humanitarian suffering. Of course it is right that we need diplomatic effort to get a political solution to what is happening in Syria, and we will continue to push on that diplomatic effort, as we do with a variety of international partners, and we will continue to support the UN intervention in the Geneva process.
Drew Hendry.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has described this action as a targeted strike that does not increase tensions in the region. If that is the case, can she confirm that she's ruled out the possibility of any retaliation from Russia?
Prime Minister.
As I have said in response to a number of questions, when we were looking at this action, one of the issues that we took into account was the need to ensure that we minimise the risk of escalation, and we did that.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do value the aid that we give to the region. I do value the urge that says that aid is better provided to refugees in the region. However, parts of that region are full to capacity. 1 in 4 of the population of Lebanon is now a Syrian refugee, and that country is struggling. Is now not the time, Mr. Speaker, for the Prime Minister urgently to review at the Brussels conference next week as many and different options for helping refugees in and out of region as we possibly can?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful for the Honourable Lady and what she says in terms of valuing the support that we are showing to refugees. I think it is important that we have been providing support in those countries of the region that have accepted significant numbers of refugees from Syria. She refers to Lebanon, of course, Turkey and Jordan are also accepted significant numbers. And we are addressing this across a number of fronts, both providing that support in region, bringing some refugees here to the United Kingdom, but also encouraging other countries to ensure that they step up and provide that support as well. As she says, we value the fact that we're the second biggest bilateral donor. We want to encourage others to also step up in terms of the support they're giving.
Chris Stevens.
This is obviously the first major military action since the publication of the Chilcot report, which recommended the need for public support and public understanding and for sound legal advice. So given that Parliament wasn't recalled and legal advice was published after the fact, is it the government's position that it rejects those Chilcot recommendations?
The government was clear in its response to the Chilcot recommendations, and I suggest the honourable gentleman looks at the response that we provided.
Alison Hewlett.
Mr. Speaker, for this action alone, the 8 Storm Shadow missiles cost £6,320,000. Deploying an RAF Tornado GR4 reportedly costs £35,000 per plane per hour. How much money is the Prime Minister willing to invest in winning the peace in Syria and rebuilding?
Prime Minister.
We've also provided nearly £2.5 billion of humanitarian support for the refugees from Syria. But can I say to the Honourable Lady that we acted because the Syrian regime was using chemical weapons, had done so on a number of occasions, and it is important that we alleviate future humanitarian suffering by degrading their capability to do so.
Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Except for the target list, there was very little in the Prime Minister's statement that could not have been said to Parliament and to the public last week. Can I ask the Prime Minister, in reviewing what has happened in the last week, whether she and her advisers could review whether she could be clearer about the strategy, objectives and legality ahead of action that could have taken more of the public with her, because I fear those actions and decisions not to reveal that has produced the opposite effect with the public.
Say to the honourable gentleman that I've answered the question about the timetable for the decision and the fact that that was taken and that Parliament did not have an opportunity to discuss it in advance of that decision. That is why I've come at the first possible opportunity to enable everybody to have the opportunity to question me in relation to that and to set out clearly in my statement the basis on which we took the action.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. While I acknowledge readily that the DUP are the largest party representing people in Northern Ireland, the 10 DUP members do not speak for everyone in Northern Ireland, and they certainly do not speak for me. And so may I reflect to the Prime Minister, as graciously and gently as I can, that there are many, many people in Northern Ireland, including myself, who are bitterly, bitterly disappointed that the Prime Minister did not seek to recall Parliament and seek our approval. It is a different matter when individual MPs have on their conscience walking into a division lobby, supporting or voting against military action. I know, because I've got the scars on my back to say that. And so I would like the Prime Minister to address the real risks that none of us should minimise, and I'm not suggesting we are, of escalating the appalling conflict in Syria, and also inviting upon us retaliation from Russia. Those are the assurances that I seek from the Prime Minister, not just for the people of Northern Ireland, but for the entire country.
Prime Minister.
I say to the Honourable Lady, as I have in response to others, that issue of escalation, which I recognise that she and others have identified, that issue of the risk of escalation was one which was considered when we took the action, and the action was taken in a way to minimise the risk of escalation. That this was targeted, it was limited, it was about degrading the capability of the Syrian regime in relation to its chemical weapons, and I continue to believe it's important that we give a very clear message that we will not accept the use of chemical weapons.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All right-thinking members of this House will utterly abhor the atrocious use of chemical weapons against the civilian population of Syria, which constitutes a gratuitous war crime upon that population. But the Prime Minister said that there was an immediate need to act, contravening the normal practice of consulting Parliament prior to any military action overseas, due to the immediate need to alleviate further humanitarian disasters in Syria. Was that based on a specific intelligence report that there was an imminent risk of further chemical weapons attacks in Syria? And also, would the Prime Minister accept and agree with me that the key way to prevent further attacks in the future is to achieve a no-fly zone and no-bombing zone internationally policed by the United Nations in Syria, and that would be a way to deny the Syrian Air Force access to the delivery of these weapons?
Prime Minister.
As I laid out in my statement, there is evidence, there's been clear evidence of a continuing use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime in Syria. And having seen what had happened in Douma, having given time to make the appropriate assessments of what had happened in Douma, to make the proper planning for strikes, and to take those strikes in a timely fashion to ensure that they were effective and had an impact on the chemical weapons capability of the Syrian regime, was the basis on which we took the decision that we took. It was quite clear, I think, from the behaviour we have seen from the Syrian regime, that they will be prepared to continue to use chemical weapons with the danger to civilians that we had already seen in Douma and elsewhere, and in preventing humanitarian suffering for the future. That was the basis on which we took that action.
Order. Before we move on to the next business, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Scottish National Party, and all 140 backbench members who've questioned the Prime Minister over the last 3 hours. Thank you. Business statement.